Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Hi, สวัสดีครับ I would like to take this opportunity to welcome all of you to Bangkok Business and Human Rights Week, an event that synergizes our effort and all the energy from stakeholders from various sectors who care about human rights and business in our region. My name is Natwood Pimpa and I am an associate professor from the College of Management at Mahidol University and from the ASEAN Centre for Studies in Sustainable Development Dialogue, and I am your host for today. Well, this important event is it's significant for us because this year marks the 5th anniversary of the event. And this is an event whereby multiple stakeholders unpack various elements of the business and human rights agenda. Responsible business as well as business practices, sustainable development in the Asia Pacific will be the issue. To kickstart a week-long annual event, it is a great privilege for us to organize the inaugural ASEAN Suites Forum on SDG 12, Responsible Consumption and Production, as well as Business and Human Rights, a peer learning event, and we are live from Bangkok at the moment. Well, this event is co-organized by the Swiss government and the ASEAN Centre for Sustainable Development Studies and Dialogue. The forum underlines collaboration between ASEAN and the Swiss government. Indeed, it takes us back to the time when all members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations promote the synergy of complementarities between the ASEAN Community Vision 2025 and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or SDG, right? Well, obviously, SDG 12 is among the 5 complementarities initiative. The Swiss government has been among the major actors in promoting responsible consumption and production in our region and, of course, worldwide. Well, since this event is designed as a peer learning event, allow me to share with you that the translation to the regional language is available to all of you. We have service in Khmer, Vietnamese, Bahasa Indonesia, and of course Thai. Okay, this event will show us experiences among friends from various sectors, and we will discuss and learn among all of us in this important issue from peers and of course by peers. Today's forum is one of example of how key partners such as ASEAN, such as the Swiss government, UNDP, the United Nations Global Compact Network, AISHA, and Rights, Liberty, Protection Department, Ministry of Justice, and Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Thailand, work together and act upon the promotion of SDG 12 through the lens of business and human rights. The structure of the event will be really exciting to all of us. We certainly kickstart this Bangkok Business and Human Rights Week with this particular forum today. The keynote speeches from speakers from the region, followed up by 2 panel discussion. And in the 3rd segment of today's event, we have organized 3 workshops to discuss important issues from the legal framework to COVID-19 and business and human rights in the region. So this is really exciting event for all of us. Due to the current global crisis of COVID-19, we, the organizer of the event, put your health as our priority. So this forum is designed and delivered to all of you in the online webinar format. Once again, we sincerely thank ASEAN to make this event a reality to all of us. Now, we would like to gently remind all participants to keep your microphone muted at all times. Only turn it on when you take the floor. If multiple participants sit in one location, we kindly request you to use only one device to join the meeting. In case multiple devices are used, please ensure that only one device's speaker and microphone are on to avoid echoing the background. If you experience any technical issues while participating at this event, please feel free to contact our staff online, please. And without further ado, I would like to invite His Excellency Mr. Visit Soraat, the Permanent Secretary from the Ministry of Justice, Thailand, to deliver his opening remarks for the 2021 Bangkok Business and Human Rights Week. You have the floor, sir.
Excellencies, distinguished guests and participants, ladies and gentlemen. A very good morning and warmest greetings from Bangkok to all of you. On behalf of the Royal Thai government, I would like to warmly welcome all distinguished participants attending the Bangkok Business and Human Rights Week 2021. I would also like to take this opportunity to express my appreciation to all co-organizers of this event, in particular, the United Nations Development Programme, or UNDP, Global Compact Network Thailand, the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, the Government of Switzerland, the ASEAN Centre for Sustainable Development Studies and Dialogue, as well as the Ministry of Justice of the Kingdom of Thailand. I am delighted that we are together here again to mark the 5th Bangkok Business and Human Rights Week, to reaffirm our robust partnerships to drive momentum in support of the business and human rights, responsible business conduct, and sustainable development agendas. This year, our week-long annual event composes of two principal activities. First, the ASEAN-Swiss Forum on SDG 12, Responsible Consumption and Production, and Business and Human Rights, a peer learning event. Second, the United Nations Responsible Business and Human Rights Forum, New Decade of Action, RBHR Forum 2021. I believe that these activities will provide you all with the great opportunity to learn and share your work, as well as experiences with each other, not only limited within Asia-Pacific region, but also beyond our region as well. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to update you about the progress in Thailand. As you are well aware that with strong cooperative partnerships among all relevant stakeholders, including the public sectors, the business sectors, the state-owned enterprises, civil society organizations, and international organizations, Thailand became the first country in Asia to have a standalone 4-year National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, or NAP, in short, covering 2019 to 2022. In recent years, Thailand has made substantial strides towards the implementation of the NAP and UNGPs, with significant impact in the country. It includes tax reductions being offered to firms hiring formerly incarcerated, which engages companies and business in preventing recidivism and boosting social reintegration. The Human Rights Award was initiated 2 years ago to encourage responsible business sectors to be a role model for their friends. Listed companies are required to disclose human rights practices in one report to enhance transparency for the purpose of discharging corporate accountability to their workforce. 15 commercial banks and the Bank of Thailand signed the MOU to form the Sustainable Banking Guidelines, as well as to promote responsible lending in order to ensure all the operations complying to good governance, social and environmental responsibility. Moreover, Thailand is moving forward an enactment of anti-SLAPP legislation and amendment of Witness Protection Act to enhance protection to human rights defenders. In addition, A subcommittee to drive forward the NAP under the supervision of a national committee to drive forward human rights works in Thailand was established as a monitoring mechanism of the implementation of the NAP. The Business and Human Rights IT system was also set up as a channel to report the outcome of the implementation of the plan. Difficulties encountered, changes introduced, as well as the degree of achievement which will finally be submitted to the Cabinet for review. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, there is always more that we can do. We need to promote greater understanding of human rights and responsible conduct to business, especially to the SMEs, on how they can integrate human rights consideration into their operations. More can be done on establishing an effective mechanism or as a responsible entity to monitor outbound investment. Most importantly, successful implementation of the business and human rights, responsible business conduct, and sustainable development agendas requires that they be owned and understood by multiple ministries, state-owned enterprises, private sectors, trade unions, civil society sectors, national human rights institutions, local authorities, and the public. The Bangkok Business and Human Rights Week, hosted annually with cooperation of our partners, is one of the platforms that can help raise awareness and ensure effectiveness implementation of those agendas, not only for Thailand but also for our friends in the region and beyond as well. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, at present, progress has been made across ASEAN region. However, the unprecedented economic and social disruption caused by the continuing COVID-19 pandemic resulted in considerable increased unemployment, insecurity, and poverty. In this regard, we need to ensure that human rights responsibilities of businesses must be respected in mitigating the socio-economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and building our region back stronger. For this reason, I am pleased that this week-long event will also focus on the important issues of SDG 12 and the responsible businesses and human rights as we together address the daunting post-COVID recovery challenges. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, I wish to reaffirm Thailand's readiness to work with all partners, whether at the regional or international levels, on the promotion of business and human rights, responsible business conduct, as well as sustainable development goals, with the aim of creating a people-centered and resilient community that leaves no one behind. May I end by wishing all participants a most productive and fruitful week ahead. Let us together put SDG 12 and the responsible businesses and human rights into practice. I thank you all for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, His Excellency Mr. Visit Sarat, the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Justice. And we look forward to celebrating and actively participating at a week-long event, Bangkok Business and Human Rights Week. Well, next, move on to another person. As I mentioned to you that the Swiss government is a key partner of this forum, and we have organized a very important activity today for you. I would like to share with you the concept of this forum for today. The title is the Swiss Forum on SDG 12, Business and Human Rights. And this is really a great pleasure for the organizer to have an honor from His Excellency Mr. Thani Thongpakdi, the Permanent Secretary from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Thailand, to deliver the remark. And the topic will be enhancing sustainable development cooperation in ASEAN through the Complementarities Initiative. Please welcome His Excellency Mr. Thani.
Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to join everyone at today's ASEAN Swiss Peer Learning event. Thailand has served as the ASEAN Coordinator on Sustainable Development Cooperation since 2016, forging closer partnerships within ASEAN and with external partners on the sustainability agenda. However, efforts have been disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic. The impact has been unforgiving on hundreds of millions of lives, undoing our hard-won progress towards achieving the SDGs. International cooperation has suffered a setback, but as global vaccination is scaling up, the world can look forward to a return to normalcy, revive economies, and reconnect communities. It is now more important than ever to enhance cooperation on the sustainability agenda if we are to build back better and stronger. As we tackle the socio-economic impact of the pandemic, sustainability and sustainable development must continue to be a strategic priority throughout our response. This has been reflected in the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework recently adopted to underpin ASEAN's recovery from COVID-19. The framework embraces ASEAN's efforts to date in advancing sustainable development cooperation through promoting complementarities between the ASEAN Community Vision 2025 and the 2030 UN Agenda on Sustainable Development, or the so-called Complementaries Initiative. The aim is to develop cooperation linkages between relevant regional and global initiatives and frameworks to ensure that no one is left behind. The Complementarities Roadmap, developed in collaboration with UN SCAP, identified potential actions and deliverables in 5+1 priority areas, namely poverty eradication, infrastructure and connectivity, sustainable management of natural resources, sustainable consumption and production, and resilience, with cooperation on capacity building cutting across all priority areas. Furthermore, Thailand and UNESCAP have co-hosted the annual high-level brainstorming dialogue on the Complementarities Initiative since 2017 to serve as a regional platform for ASEAN member states, the ASEAN Secretariat, UN agencies, and other external partners of ASEAN to exchange views on how they can concretely advance sustainable development in the region. The ASEAN Centre for Sustainable Development Studies and Dialogue also plays an important catalytic role in this regional endeavour, as is clearly evidenced in its partnership with Switzerland today. Thailand will continue to render our support to the Centre. Ladies and gentlemen, SDG 12 covers Sustainable or Responsible Consumption and Production, or RCP, which I earlier mentioned is a priority area under the Complementarities Initiative. This is crucial as ASEAN is considered an important global hub of manufacturing and one of the fastest growing consumer markets. To preserve the region's remarkable biodiversity and improve the quality of life of our people, we must seriously address the way business is conducted and the interaction between human and environmental systems. Against this backdrop, today's event is a good opportunity for exchanging experiences on advancing SDG 12 while complying with business and human rights practices consistent with the UN Guiding Principles on BHR. RCP and BHR must be part and parcel of business operations. We must ensure that businesses implement due diligence in all stages of their operations and that their supply and value chains are truly sustainable. Thus, the forum's emphasis on agri-food production is strongly welcomed. Agriculture is a major sector in ASEAN, as it accounts for around 25% of GDP and 40% of total employment in some ASEAN member states. Ensuring responsible business conduct in this sector is therefore important for our people's well-being and our region's prosperity. Ladies and gentlemen, since the beginning of this year, ASEAN has entrusted Thailand to examine the Bio-Circular Green Economic Model as a strategy for ASEAN's post-COVID recovery and sustainable future growth. COVID-19 is a wake-up call for the need to adopt a sustainable and balanced way of living. The BCG model can be part of the solution as it aims to promote economic growth that is based on efficient use of resources, waste reduction, and low carbon emissions. Such an approach can also help to reduce environmental impacts, which could impede economic and social rights, including the rights to health and water. The BCG model neatly aligns with the targets of SDG 12. In this regard, I encourage participants to also look into how to promote synergy with the BCG model in your deliberations, including through sharing of best practices and knowledge on employment of green and innovative technologies. Ladies and gentlemen, sustainable development is cross-cutting by nature. Attaining it requires a cross-sectorial and multi-stakeholder approach of partnership for sustainability. At this forum, I believe we are heading in the right direction as all relevant stakeholders are present. To take forward cooperation on sustainable consumption and production under the Complementarities Initiative, Thailand will work towards promoting knowledge sharing between ASEAN and ASEAN's partners on relevant areas of the BCG model for such sectors as food and agriculture, renewable energy, manufacturing, and sustainable tourism. Such an undertaking will help enhance the capacity of ASEAN member states to achieve targets under SDG 12. In closing, I would like to thank Switzerland for co-hosting this event. Switzerland is a valuable partner of ASEAN and Thailand, particularly as we celebrate the 90th anniversary of Thai-Swiss diplomatic relations this year. We want to see this mutually beneficial partnership continue to grow. With these remarks, I wish this forum every success in advancing the RCP and BHR agenda and contribute to the realization of the SDGs and robust recovery of the region. I thank you.
And that is His Excellency Mr. Thani Thongpakdi, the Permanent Secretary from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Thailand. Thank you so much for your remarks. Well, as I mentioned that the Swiss government has played a pivotal role in the promotion and take some actions in the promotion of SDG 12. For example, today we are doing live at a very comfortable Embassy of Switzerland in Bangkok, Thailand. I therefore would like to take this opportunity to invite the third keynote speaker, and that is Her Excellency Ms. Hélène Bourliger-Artelda, the Ambassador of Switzerland to Thailand, Cambodia, and Laos PDR, to deliver her remarks on promoting responsible business conduct along agricultural supply chains in Switzerland perspective. You have your floor, please, Your Excellency.
Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Justice, Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador Narong from the ASEAN Centre for Sustainable Development Studies and Dialogue, dear moderators, panelists, participants, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor and privilege for me to speak to you today about SDG 12 and business and human rights. It's a very vast topic, so together with Ambassador Narong, our team decided to focus, as you heard already from our MC, on responsible business conduct along agricultural supply chains. Wow, quite a mouthful. So let me try to simplify things. I take this coconut, since we're in Thailand and not in Switzerland, and I take a can. So what we're trying to do actually today is to discuss how this coconut gets in a sustainable way into the can. And of course, we could have picked several angles to discuss it. Biodiversity, very important when we talk about sustainable consumption of food. So are there going to be enough coconut trees in the future and a variety of coconut trees? Or maybe there are going to be too many coconut trees and we're going to destroy other important natural habitat or even destroy forests. That's not the angle we're picking today. We could look at the can and say, and have a really meaningful discussion around recycling of waste. Honestly, I'm always very saddened when I read that parts of a can end up in the stomach of a fish, or this latch apparently is very dangerous for birds. So that would also be a very meaningful discussion we can have today. But we decided to focus on business and human rights, because thanks to the Thai government, actually, I was privileged to see how this coconut ends up in the can personally. And although, of course, the can is produced in what we nowadays call agro-industry, there is quite a lot of labor by humans that still goes into harvesting the coconut, getting it ready so that it can be processed in the factory. So I think talking about human rights, human dignity, when we talk about processing food is a very good angle, and that's what we're going to concentrate on today. And let me be clear on the can. Of course, this can needs to produce a profit. Nothing wrong with that. Companies need to be successful, because successful companies, if they do it in an ethical way, they will actually be able to create wealth, value for their owners. They will be able to pay a decent wage to their staff, to their employees. And since I'm a government representative, also very important, if they're successful, they will have a profitable bottom line, and with that they will be able to pay taxes to government. So I mean, I'm very happy that this is really a diverse group of people participating today, but I would also particularly like to welcome private sector. Because if we have a conversation on business and human rights, private sector needs to be in the room. It's getting heavy. You allow me to put it back. And I want to share another story with you. My grandmother, Maria, born in Switzerland, she was actually born during the First World War. And she, of course, also experienced Second World War. And my grandparents were living in a house about 20 minutes from Zurich, Zurich being the biggest city of Switzerland. And for Swiss standards, they actually had quite a big garden around that house. So up front, my grandmother would plant flowers, something nice on the eye, so that neighbors could see that she kept a tidy house and a tidy garden. But when things became more difficult at the back, she would plant vegetables, potato, carrots, and so on. And she would also have fruit trees, bushes, berries, apple, pear, and so on. And at certain times, they would even have livestock. They would have chickens, rabbits, and at one point, I think even 2 to 3 cattle for milk. And don't get me wrong, they were living in an urban space. They were by no means farmers. And for the rest, what they couldn't produce at the backyard of their house, she wasn't driving a car, so she would take her bicycle and would go to local shops and purchase whatever she needed from local butchers, baker, and so on. And I would say most of the product that actually they bought would be either local, regional, at best maybe from a neighboring European country. So if I would have to guess, 70 to 80% what was on my grandmother's table, everyday kitchen or dining table, was locally or regionally produced, and they basically knew where things were coming from. Back then, not everything might have been organic, but the origin of the food and how it ended up on the table was very, very clear. But it's also important to say that at that time, and I had to look it up, globalization had not started, and the world population stood at estimated 1.8 billion people. So now I quickly fast forward to today. You were told we're here at the Swiss residence, so that means I'm living and working in downtown Bangkok. And if I look at my food consumption, it looks radically different. Up to 98% of all my food gets bought in supermarkets and local markets. It's actually my husband Alex and our chef Kun Kong who do the shopping. And we are fully in the hands of food producers and vendors. Sure, we look out for locally produced and or organic products, but as an average consumer, there is very little that I can do to make sure that the principles of SDG 12 are actually fully respected. Also, I think it's important to know that currently we are an estimated 7.8 billion people living on planet Earth. And I mean, I took my grandmother Maria, but it's just 2 generations back. You were probably wondering why I say 98%. The 2% actually is due to the Green Embassy team that we have at the Swiss Embassy. We have quite a big plot here. And so some members of the Green Embassy team decided to create an urban garden. So I get some vegetable there. So we're actually famous in town for our Italian basil. And what we also do, we partnered up as an embassy with a small Thai NGO called Happy Groceries, and they come here every now and then and they sell fresh produce to us, fruits, sometimes even eggs and so on. And my team actually went there and had a look, and so we're very pleased to work with them. And this is the 2% where I can actually have a closer look on what is ending up on my table. So with this little personal example, what I'm actually trying to say is that it is of utmost importance that politicians and governments legislate and regulate the space correctly, that academia delivers scientific data and sustainable methods of food production, that civil society remains vigilant. You are actually my extended arm, and you are also a source of inspiration and keep all of us on our toes and accountable to people. And most importantly, as a consumer, as all of us are consumers here in the space, we have to be able to trust the private sector. We have to be able to trust you, the private sector, that you will go and produce food in a responsible and ethical manner. All of us, we need food. We need food like an engine needs a source of energy to work. And similar to an engine, the type of energy we consume has not only an effect on us and on our well-being, our well-functioning, but also on who produced it and how it affected the environment. In fact, the way we produce and consume food is one of the most important elements in determining the chances for a sustainable future. I wish you good and productive deliberations. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay,ครับ. And thank you so much, Her Excellency, Ms. Helen Puletka, for your opening speech for the forum. This is really exciting for us, and I think her thought-provoking speech will get us to think more about the importance of today's event, where we'll focus on various aspects of business human rights, as well as how can we really consume and produce responsibly. Okay, well, that is the official opening ceremony of the event, and let me remind you, this is just the beginning of the event. We have a day-long event to work with you, and you will meet, you have this opportunity to hear views and voices from experts, practitioners, academics, and government representatives from worldwide on this particular event, so stay with us. Well, right after this, we will take a short break for 10 minutes, And then we'll go to the segment 2 of the event, which is very interesting panel. The first panel, which will return at 10:45, we will discuss an important event on human rights and due diligence during this tough COVID-19 era. Okay, so please stay tuned, you stay with us, and we will be able to come back after the break. Let's meet each other at 10:45. Stay tuned, please. Welcome back to the ASEAN Swiss Forum on Business and Human Rights and SDG 12. Okay, I hope you had a great break, and now we are back with the segment on discussion. Panel 1, which we'll share the next hours with you, will focus pretty much on human rights due diligence during the COVID-19, which is global pandemic, and we all face, experience, and understand how tough it is at this current crisis. And this particular forum, we hope that we will listen to more dynamic conversation and point experiences from the region, story that will lead us to understanding in relation to human rights due diligence and how SDG 12, particularly in agri-food sectors, as well as the challenges related to COVID-19 crisis. With no further ado, please welcome the moderator of the panel, Dr. Seri Nontasud, who is the member of the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and Governor of Stock Exchange of Thailand, to moderate this panel. Please welcome Dr. Seri, ladies and gentlemen.
I'd like to thank first the organizers, particularly the Swiss Embassy, as well as the Sustainable Development Institute of Mahidol University. I recall fondly this particular event that we originally organized in 2017, the Bangkok Business and Human Rights Week, and this is its 5th installment. So I'm particularly pleased to see the continuity of the stream of event that we organized since 2017. By way of introduction, I think the ambassador has aptly shown the example of coconut and can, but to give us the broad overview of what we should expect from this particular session, I like to share just one page by way of introduction to you of what we expect to see in this panel. This inaugural session is about due diligence in times of COVID-19. We want to see the intersection of SDG 12, which is about responsible consumption and production, or otherwise is known also as sustainable consumption and production, SCP. Among its core indicators are management of use of natural resources, food waste, chemicals and waste, reduction of waste generation, as well as other rather unfamiliar indicators like reporting, public procurement, and last but not least, sustainable lifestyles. SDG 12 is underpinned and supported by implementation at various levels, including regional action, national commitments, business agendas, and we must not forget monitoring and assessment. In terms of the ecosystem of SDG 12, we see the interlinkages between this particular SDG and other SDG, all other 16 SDGs, which form a coherent ecosystem of sustainable development. It is also complemented by other similar goals implemented by stakeholders, including circular economy, or what Ambassador Thani called BCG model that is being implemented in Thailand, and also underpinned by the National Action Plan, which is itself an implementation tool of the United Nations Global Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And we are talking about, in this first session, the mainstreaming of human rights due diligence. We want also to talk about the interlinkages with capital market regulations, and last but not least, the impact from COVID-19 to the implementation and direction of SDG 12 itself. We have 5 speakers. From Global Compact Network Thailand, we'll hear about the tools and indicators that they have developed, as well as the power of alliance that they have established with more than 70 members just in Thailand. We want to hear also the challenges that they have faced in mainstreaming human rights due diligence in their operation. Secondly, we will have the Secretary General of Government Pension Fund talking about the role of institutional investor in selecting companies that have implemented SDG 12. And also, we have a keyword of ESG alignment, which stands for environment, social, and governance, which is a lens for the government pension fund to select the investment destination or companies that it would like to invest in. We will also be hearing from our colleague from the International Labour Organization as regards labor and supply chain concerns. And we'll have, very fortunate to have national examples from our colleague from Vietnam, who will be talking about how companies and institutions in Vietnam have mainstreamed SDG 12. And last but not least, we have a direct example from global M&E, Nestle, to reflect on how global company like Nestle have implemented SDG 12. With no further ado, I would like to invite our first speaker, Dr. Netitorn, who's representing the Global Compact Network Thailand. While he's speaking, I would like to remind you that we are benefiting from Zoom channel. So if you have questions or comments, feel free to post it into the chat box, and we'll be collecting your questions and comments later on during the Q&A. So with no further ado, Dr. Netitorn, you have the floor.
ครับขอบคุณครับอาจารย์เสรีครับ Good morning everyone ได้ยินเสียงโอเคใช่ไหมครับอาจารย์ครับ
Yes.
Okay ครับ Well, let me start by thanking the organizers, the government of Switzerland, the ACSBSD, and the others for inviting me to join this panel on behalf of Global Compact Network Thailand. I'm particularly pleased that this event forms part of the 5th Bangkok Business and Human Rights Week starting today. It signals the commitments and important contributions from not only Thailand, but all stakeholders from the region towards the promotion of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, or the UNGPs. I'd like to start with a brief background of our network. We are a business association operating under the UN Global Compact from New York. All members have to live up to the 10 universal principles, which are divided into 4 areas: human rights, labor, the environment, and anti-corruption. In addition, contributions towards the achievement of the SDGs is high on our agenda. Currently, we have 70 members operating across all major sectors of the Thai industry and comprising of various business sizes. The total market capital of our members is valued at around $132 billion. Therefore, we see ourselves as a major contributor to Thailand's achievement of the SDGs. In terms of the food systems, we have a large number of key system players, from producers, packaging, retail, hospitality, and technology. To build back better and support the decade of action, last year, 21 of our members committed to investing in around 1,000 projects related to 17 SDGs and valued over $40 billion. Interaction with our members has given us insights into Thailand's business and human rights landscape and beyond. Moreover, last year, we set up the Business and Human Rights Academy in response to the growing needs for hands-on trainings, practical tools, and technical advice in order to put the UN Guiding Principles into practice. We have been fortunate to work with such partners as the Rights and Liberties Protection Department of the Ministry of Justice, the UNDP, the Stock Exchange Commission of Thailand, and the Office of the National Human Rights Commission, and Dr. Seri yourself on the establishment of the Academy. Thank you, Krab. It's important to place both human rights due diligence in the agri-food sector and SDG 12 into perspective. Based on the SDG 12 breakdown that the Seri told us just now, SDG 12 is indeed multidimensional, ranging from consumption and production behaviors to reporting. Today, I'm trying to make a case on how to enable the human rights due diligence process to support the achievement of SDG 12. If conducted effectively, the human rights due diligence will help ensure that the rights holders in the food systems are not at risk, or if they were, there's fair remediation. It's also timely to reflect on how we can effectively put the UNGPs into practice as we celebrate the 10th anniversary of its adoption this year. I'd like to touch upon two topics today. First, the global context. There are at least three factors for consideration. One is certainly the impact of COVID-19 on business conduct and our efforts on the SDGs as a whole. COVID-19 has inevitably put businesses around the world in a survival mode. A recent SPAP report also shows regression in not only SDG 12, but also 13, climate action, and 16, peace and justice. I thank Dr. Kit for this observation. It is incumbent upon all of us now to turn COVID-19 into an opportunity, into a catalyst for the business sector to take upon human rights due diligence as part of their future protection against crisis. An example is that the human rights due diligence during COVID-19 might review the corporate risk areas overlooked earlier, such as migrant workers' access to basic health care. The other part of the global context is the growing pressure from all sides for companies by increasingly imposing mandatory human rights due diligence. The financial community has been active, as we will hear next from Thailand's government pension fund. In terms of legislation, the UK's Anti-Modern Slavery Act and the upcoming EU's mandatory human rights due diligence are the case in point. The EU legislation will require EU domiciled companies and foreign companies selling or providing services in the internal market to conduct due diligence across their supply and value chains. The question is how to prepare the companies for such a requirement. The last part of the global context is how to connect the dots between the human rights due diligence process and other corporate sustainability agendas, such as climate change. While we celebrate the 10th anniversary of the UNGPs, we should not lose sight of other global conversations related to the agri-food sector, such as the UN Food System Summit and the UNFCCC COP26 on climate. Corporates need to apply human rights lens in their net zero conversations as well, for example. Second, having demonstrated the context above, the question is now what? I will only raise a number of brief observations here. First, how to provide capacity building, technical assistance, and incentives. Strengthening corporate human rights capacity, such as thorough human rights due diligence, requires investment in the corporate resources. The challenge is how to make such investment attractive and practical so that human rights due diligence widely becomes a norm among the private sector. What's the value proposition for companies? Capacity building and technical support should be provided for businesses during this transition. It is particularly important and necessary as we try to engage small and medium enterprises to get on board with human rights due diligence as part of our supply chain management. This is precisely why the Global Compact Network Thailand Business and Human Rights Academy has been established. At the same time, more practical tools should be available in order to assist companies with varying capacity. A good example was from UNDP's 2021 edition of Human Rights Due Diligence and COVID-19, a rapid self-assessment for business. Level playing fields, how to ensure that the company taking up on proper human rights due diligence would not lose competition due to its increased costs, either domestically or globally. Related to the above, is there a reward scheme for those companies doing so as an incentive? Measurement, benchmarking, and data are also needed. Better measurement brings better data, and better data bring better policy, implementation, risk assessment, and monitoring. A good example came from Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, or CHRB. It revealed last year that out of 229 global companies assessed, 104, or close to 50%, had at least one allegation of a serious human rights impact, where a majority of them, or 51%, fall in the East Asia and the Pacific and South Asian regions. More of this benchmarking data are encouraged for constructive and not name and shame purpose. It might help review the gender lens in our business conduct as well. CCNT will also conduct its own benchmarking exercise this year. Despite CHRB's good efforts, tracking human rights progress will remain, however, a major challenge. If done successfully, it will certainly help identify gaps among corporates in the four major risk areas of human rights in the agri-food sector, which are fundamental labor rights, working conditions, social, environmental, and economic rights, and civil and political rights. I have two more observations, please. Related to the importance of data, reporting will certainly help promote transparency and track comparative progress, hence creating peer competition. One commendable example comes from Thailand Stock Exchange Commission, that requires Thai-listed companies to file their human rights performance as part of their annual report. Certainly, we should watch out for the capacity to do so across sectors. CHRB pointed out in their 2019 benchmarking exercise that more than half of agribusinesses were in the lowest performance bands, indicating a failure within the sector to implement the UNTPs. Then how do we actually encourage cross-sectoral improvement in performance, especially in the agri-food sector? And my last observation is technology, which can play many roles to support my observations above. For example, how to scale up blockchain usage in managing migrant workers' documents. This will help reducing the risk of forced labor and reinforcing ethical recruitment. Automation can decrease the labor's exposure to inhumane working conditions. Development of e-learning toolkits on corporate human rights due diligence in multi-languages will promote accessibility to and hopefully reduce cost of trainings. In the end, digital management of human rights related performance data will facilitate tracking, benchmarking, and reporting, among others. So these points are the big picture survey, which hopefully will help kick off further discussions. Back to you now, Dr. Seri. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nediton Pradipsan of the Global Compact Network, Thailand. I see a number of points, very salient points. Number one is regression. And this is also reflected in the comment by Professor Wittit. We must not forget that COVID-19 has caused significant regression in overall implementation of the SDGs. And you have rightly put that it is impacting SDG 12. Professor Wittit is reminding us that also SDG 16 has been impacted. And also capacity building and technical support must be on the radar, as well as incentive scheme to help push SMEs into the bandwagon of champions of SDG 12. We must not forget also the importance of data and corporate benchmarking. And last but not least, is the issue of digitalization, which and I really appreciate the comments by Professor Wittit, who reminds us also not to forget the issue of gender, which will be touched upon by a colleague from ILO later on. Now I will pass the floor to Dr. Srikanya Yatip, who is the Secretary General of the Government Pension Fund, one of the top two institutional investors in Thailand. And the GPF has done a remarkable job in mainstreaming UNGPs, particularly human rights due diligence in the selection of its investment destination. So let's hear from Dr. Srikanya, her salient point of the GPF. Dr. Srikanya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Seri, and thank you, Swiss Embassy and the ASEAN Centre for Sustainability Development Study and Dialogue for organizing such a very important event, and thank you for having me. I have prepared 2 pages of presentation to help clarifying my point, as I only have 5 minute time slot and for such a big discussion. And okay, here come my first slides. In the first slide, what I'd like to talk about is that our ambition. GPF has announced our ambition to become the leader in ESG investing and initiative in 2019. And our responsible investment framework is divided into 2 key areas: domestic investment and global investment. On the left-hand side, you can see domestic investment. In our context, domestic investment, investing locally in Thai equity, Thai fixed income, Thai real estate, and Thai private equity through our internal investment team, and also through our external local fund managers. Both teams are mandated to comply with our ESG selection criteria. For Thai equity, our criteria require that any potential stock to be eligible in our universe must be listed in the THSI. It stands for Thailand Sustainability Investment Index. This index is set by Stock Exchange of Thailand, or SET. Those companies has to comply by this rule, and also has to comply to the sustainability disclosure. Also, this one is set by SET. And better yet, if they can win the SET Sustainability Award, that would be great for us. Then those stocks would be included in our universe. But when it comes to decision making, whether to invest in the stock or not, we will qualitatively and quantitatively value the stock based on finance factors and ESG factors. In integrating ESG factors in the valuation, we are using ESG integrated asset valuation methodology. The approach and formula we developed with technical assistance from the World Bank. Lastly, the target company must not be listed in our negative list. The negative list is a list of companies that fail to comply to SEC, the Security and Exchange Commission rules, or having issue of ESG practices. For global investment on the right-hand side, for the global investment, we invest through our external fund manager. We have a broad framework for them that any investment on our behalf must be aligned with SDG taxonomy, minimizing SDG risk exposure, and maximizing SDG alliance. Our manager must align their investment decision and process with also PRI and OECD. Otherwise, they would have to explain the framework that they are using. It's a basic comply or explain rule that we tell our external fund managers. In terms of rating and benchmark, most of our external fund manager, global fund manager, they are using their own customized index and rating because they feel that they are more customized and much more local than the provider in the market. Can I have my next slide, please? The next slides show our responsible investing mix strategy. This is based on the 5-pillar framework of sustainability: manufactured capitals, financial capital, social capital, human capitals, and nature capitals. Our area of focus are on nature capitals, human capital, which certainly include social capitals and financial capitals. In having those capitals as underlining, GPF has mix of strategy when it comes to investing. In the past, we used to be at level 1, traditional investing, as we didn't explicitly incorporate ESG data into our investment process. Today, we are somewhere around level 4 and a little of 5, as we have fiduciary responsibility to pension members. And we can't go too far to any impact investing or investing for philanthropy. We cannot go that far. If that investing is purely seek for social return, regardless of investment return, So we have to balance between social return and investment return because we have the duty and commitment to our members as well. For this year in particular, we have focused our effort on human rights. We are working together with the United Nations Environment Programme, Finance Initiative, and Stock Exchange of Thailand, 2 projects. The first project is the ambition to bring awareness on human rights in education and due diligence. The second project is developing human rights heat map and come up with a common framework on human rights integration and due diligence among Thai investors and listed companies. And this morning, I'm happy to hear from Dr. Nitithorn that he is very active in this particular area. I might need his help in this topic. I discuss with him later on. Another project of this year that we are trying to bring together financial sector, investment sector to commit to responsible banking and responsible investing. Our big day is July 12 this year. We would co-organize a Sustainable Thailand Forum together with the Ministry of Finance and a lot of international organizations such as OECD, PRI, UNEP-FI, Stock Exchange of Thailand, Security and Exchange Commission, and also Kasikorn Bank, the first bank in Thailand that commit to responsible banking. To conclude, when it comes to impact investing, our term of definition means investment to generate positive both ESG performance and financial performance. To us, SDG alignment means risk to SDG prevention and mitigation. So we try to mitigate the risks. What we see is risk to those alignment is something we consider as a part of investment long-term risk as well. SDG, in fact, as in my opinion, is offering opportunities for investors like us to demonstrate leadership and initiative in responsible investing. The challenge is to find a means of embedding SDG in our investment process seamlessly so that we also can contribute to creating a world that is more sustainable, equitable, and ultimately more prosperous. Thank you. Back to you, Dr. Seri.
Thank you, Dr. Sri Kanya. Thanks a lot for the excellent points that you have raised. I think there are 2 themes of Dr. Sri Kanya's presentation. One is leverage. The GPF with its huge fund or asset under management, AUM, I think when it selects an investment target or target company, it has influence vis-a-vis that company. So it has opportunity to mainstream SDG 12 further. Number two is the balancing of social return and financial return. So this remains a challenge. But we see a great example provided by GPF and its allies. It has signed a collaborative agreement with a number of fund managers to mainstream the so-called negative list. And we would like to see SDGs 12 in particular being mainstream into the selection criteria of this alliance as well. So now we are turning our focus into to labor. The issue of labor has been picked up by Professor Vitit already, who mentioned about gender. So I'll pass the floor to our colleague from ILO, Freddie Guayacan, who is Program Manager of the Responsible Supply Chains in Asia program from the ILO Regional Office. Freddie will provide us with an overview of how of the importance of labor and SDG 12. Freddie, the floor is yours.
Dr. Siri, thank you very much. And thank you very much to the government of Switzerland for this invitation. Well, indeed, I have created one slide for this presentation just to summarize all the linkages between the sustainable production and consumption and other key SDGs. Indeed, sustainable production necessarily implies the social aspect of sustainability, and therefore good labor conditions for workers involved in the production of goods and services in supply chains, as well as the labor dimension of responsible business conduct. The targets of the Agenda 2030, as it is of your knowledge, the ones related to employment, labor, and good working conditions are referred in the SDG 8 on decent work and economic growth. In general, for the production to be sustainable, some issues related to labor need to be addressed. Well, in the first place, there are challenges in the lower tiers of global supply chains, particularly micro, small, and medium enterprises. Many of them are informal, lack of economies of scale and resources, human and financial, to include socially responsible labor practices in the production. They face also barriers to access to information related to legislation as well as codes of conduct. Working with enterprises in the lower tiers through employers' organizations, business associations, as well as with workers' organizations would indeed contribute to the sustainability of the global supply chains, to decent work, and necessarily to the achievement of other two SDGs. The first one is SDG 1, which is related to poverty reduction, as well as the SDG number 10, which is related to the reduction of inequalities. As it was mentioned before, gender equality remains a priority as well in the agenda of labor in global supply chains. Women are among the most vulnerable workers in many sectors, and that is the case indeed in the agriculture sector as well. Issues such as gender violence, gender pay gaps, access to managerial positions by women, and harassment have to be prioritized by both the private and public labor governance. And this indeed would contribute to the SDG number 5 on gender equality. There is also need for cooperation and partnerships. These challenges are nothing that can be addressed by only the policymakers or the private sector alone, but instead it needs to rely on institutional frameworks, existing institutional frameworks, as well as joint work with other relevant stakeholders. And this would be indeed related to the SDG number 12 on partnerships to achieve the SDGs. Policy dialogues, in this framework, policy dialogues are very important, bringing together the relevant ministries as well as the private sector of a strategic importance for the policy-making process. There are a couple of good examples in the region indeed. I mean, one of them is indeed here in Thailand, where the Ministry of Justice, together with the Ministry of Labor, have led some dialogues together with the private sector in the context of the implementation of the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. Another good example is in Vietnam, where the Ministry of Labor, together with the employers' organization, BCCI, had led some dialogues around the labor dimension of CSR in the seafood sector, as well as in general and in the electronic sector. It is also important to bring together in these dialogues the buyers, usually multinational enterprises, as well as the suppliers, small and medium enterprises. And it is these dialogues and provide some safe spaces for them to talk about these critical issues would indeed contribute to address issues related to labor in their respective supply chains. Also, in this framework of partnerships and cooperation, the cooperation with workers' organizations, trade unions, employers' organizations, as well as with academic institutions, think tanks, and civil society organizations is of critical importance for the sustainability of these interventions, and also to address these labor issues in the production of goods and services in supply chains. When it comes to the current context and the relevance of due diligence, well, due diligence on the labor dimension of sustainability and responsible business conduct, it's of critical importance in times of the crisis as the one we are experiencing at the moment because of the pandemic of COVID-19. Building back better and a human-centered economy necessarily means the co-creation of rebuilding of the current social contract. And by implementing social responsible labor practices and conducting due diligence along the global supply chains, well, this contributes to rebuild this social contract, but it's also critical for companies during the current crisis for a number of reasons. Well, first of all, as it was mentioned before, it helps company and supply chains to manage the risk related to labor, risk related to occupational safety and health, shortage of labor force, high rates of rotation, as well as avoided disruption of the entire supply chain. Due diligence and working on the labor aspect of responsible business conduct will be instrumental for resilience of global supply chains, as well as for managing risks associated to labor issues. How to build back better, stronger, more resilient and more fair global supply chains would remain a priority to be addressed by the policymaker as well as by the private sector. It is increasing a request also by informed consumers on the sustainable sourcing. Demands for sustainable sourcing also comes from investors, and there is increasing demand for investment portfolios with a strong ESG component, as was indeed mentioned by the presentation of the government pension fund. But governments and buyers are also requesting and demanding sustainable sourcing through different channels. Due diligence and the implementation of responsible business conduct and the implementation of socially responsible labor practices is not only the right thing to do, but there is also a strong business case in terms of competitiveness, productivity, and access to new markets. Particularly if we take into account the emerging legislation on mandatory due diligence on human rights for supply chains in different countries, as well as the sustainability clauses included in the new generation of free trade agreements and investment agreements. Finally, the message is that responsible business conduct, due diligence, as well as the implementation of international labor standards is no longer an option, but rather a requirement for the market. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Freddie. That was very helpful. I think the key message that it was delivered by you is the human rights due diligence as a risk management tools for labor concern. Mobility is number one on the priority of the impact from COVID-19, causing both the shortage of labor and also protection of labor in the impacted area. So I think the use of human rights due diligence in this context is no longer voluntary. It makes sense both in terms of human rights and also in terms of businesses. Freddie, you also mentioned about sourcing, and I think this relates very well with one of the indicators of SDG 12, which is public procurement. And I think that was touched upon on leverage presented by Dr. Sri Kanya on how the government, in this case, the GPF, has used its leverage in passing on SDG 12 through to the companies that it seeks to invest in. So likewise, government can also assert its influence via the public procurement policy, also called sourcing, from Freddie's presentation. Very well then, we are moving on to see the examples of SDGs and human rights due diligence in the context of an ASEAN country, in this case, Vietnam. We are fortunate to have Nguyen Van Thang, who's the director of the Institute for Sustainable Development at the National Economics University of Vietnam, or the NEU. Thang, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Siri. It is my great honor to be here to talk about the responsible business practice in the agriculture producer in Vietnam. I have prepared some slides to facilitate my presentation, but I will talk about three main issues. The current status of responsible business practice that we see in the cooperatives of Vietnam, what challenge that farmers are facing in applying these practices, and what role of stakeholders that we wish to promote more responsible business practices. But let me start in the next slide with the context for you to follow me easier. Well, in the past decades, Vietnam have achieved remarkable growth, but at the same time, we have paid a lot of costs on environment, and also raised a number of issues, social issues on labor relations. In that process, agriculture sector still play a very important role by contributing to GDP, to jobs, and also community well-being. So we now recognize that reinforcing responsible business in agriculture is very critical for sustainable development. So what is the current status of responsible business in Vietnam? In the next slide, I will show you that when we talk about responsible business practice, we talk about three groups of practices. First is good agriculture practices, or we call GAP. It's more for environment protection and food safety. The second group is more on social practices, where human rights come in, labor relation, consumer protection. And the third one is business integrity, where we talk about this reporting and anti-corruption, right? Well, the good news is that in the past 5 years, we have observed a positive trend of shifting to more responsible production models in agriculture, right? And our recent studies show an encouraging result, is that for cooperatives that adopt responsible business practice, they tend to have a better performance and impact to the society. Now, the reason that we learn is that the market for clean and safe products are expanding. The competition in this area are limited, and especially when producers apply responsible business practice, they also enhance their capacity over time, right? The next slide, I will show you an illustration of the cooperatives that we recently visited 2 months ago, right? On the horizontal axis, we categorize the adoption of responsible business practice into 5 categories, increasing on the right-hand side, right? And on vertical axis, we plot the performance on impact from low to high. And we see a very encouraging trend that cooperatives that adopt more and stronger responsible business practice actually have better performance. And that's provide quite a good incentives for introducing responsible business for cooperatives in coming years. Now, however, in the next slide, I will show you that the adoption of responsible business practice in Vietnam in general and in agriculture cooperative is at a very nascent stage. Most of the practices that we see are related to good agriculture practices domestically, like VietGap, related to environment and food safety. Now, social practices like human rights or business integrity practices like anti-corruption have not been paid enough attention to, right? And the adoption have been driven or pressure mainly from customer point of view. So the logic is calculative logic, right? we adopt it because it's benefit. So what challenge do cooperatives face in adopting responsible business practices that we learn from? From institutional perspective, the first challenge is land issues. We have small farmers with small land plus the state ownership policy that make it quite hard to consolidate land. And that make it harder to adopt some technology that relate to responsible business practices. The certification and trust in safe and clean products are weak, and that need strengthened from institutional perspective. From competency perspective, farmers in Vietnam have strong inertia of traditional farming, and moving to more responsible business practice may take some time. Of course, there's need on investment, capital investment, and also investment in high workforce. So what do we see as the role of stakeholders in promoting more responsible business here? From authorities, I put the word responsible management, because what we've learned is that sometimes the document, the plan, the regulation, and the enforcement in reality are not do not fit, and that makes farmers quite confused. Firstly, we think we need local authorities need to have consistent land plans, and then the plans need to be consistently implemented, right? Try to avoid impulsive direction, so to make farmers confused what to plant and how to plant it. The second role of authorities we think we need to improve is the control of standards and certification to enhance trust in the certified products, so people can know what products are clean. Third one is important. Local authorities now have funds to subsidize cooperatives, but most what we learn is they subsidize successful cooperatives, which may not need the fund much. We believe that this fund could turn into projects that strengthen capacity for communities to learn about and to start the responsible business practice, and of course anti-corruption there. Now, when we talk about social organization, I think what we learn is capacity building is very important role that social organization can have. The ideal situation that I see is that social organization can apply funds from the government and then implement projects in communities to strengthen responsible business practices. And of course, responsible business practice cannot be in place without responsible consumption. And the ambassador already mentioned responsible consumption there. Social organization and consumer in Vietnam also need to move toward more responsible consumption. So in brief, the road to responsible business in agriculture in Vietnam is long. We have just started it, but we see some positive sign. Thank you very much. Back to you, Siri.
Thank you, Tan. I think it's very helpful the way you have demonstrated. I think one of the misconceptions that you have now cast aside is that SDGs, as well as the guiding principle on business and human rights, only apply to big businesses. Now you have aptly demonstrated that both of them, the SDGs as well as UNGPs, apply to businesses large and small, and also in all sectors, particularly in agriculture as well. And I think the role of cooperatives that you have illustrated in the case of Vietnam show us that through cooperatives, we can mainstream the SDG 12 and also UNGPs, the concern for labor through the cooperatives, but they also face challenges as well. So they serve as focal point for the mainstreaming and integration of these global goals. I think the complementarities issue is also very aptly portrayed, including the anti-corruption and also certification of safe products, how it has played a role in bringing up the SDG 12 for the concern of consumer as well. We have time, and we'll be coming back to some of these salient points of Vietnam. Now, last but not least, we have the fifth speaker, who is Jan Wis. He is the Senior Public Affairs Manager at Nestle. He's now hailing directly from Switzerland, and it's now, I think, 5 a.m. or so. Jan, are you now with us? I'm passing the floor to you. Jan Wist, you have the floor. Can the embassy personnel remind me if we already have Jan Wist with us? Because now it's still very early morning in Switzerland, where Jan is based. Oh, Jan is not here yet. So perhaps we are waiting for him. We have half an hour left for our session. Perhaps I will open the floor to for questions and comments from the floor. So if anyone would like to put up any question or comments, you are feel free to do so. I see a number of comments posed by Professor Wittit. I'd like to know if Professor Wittit would like to seek the floor so you can illustrate more fully the points that you have raised in your comments. Professor Wittit, are you there? While we're waiting for him, let me go back to Dr. Nediton, who is our first speaker, perhaps, and ask him to illustrate further on the issue of SME involvement. Now, Dr. Nediton, we know that you have some 70 companies in your network who are now on the radar or on the equation to implement SDG, and including SDG 12. Let me ask you to provide us with further information on how your network engages with the SMEs for their role. Dr. Nediton.
Thank you, Dr. Seri. I think it's, as I mentioned earlier, I think the overall context now is businesses are in the survival mode. And even before the COVID-19 hit, the issue of promotion of human rights due diligence among especially the small and medium enterprises in the supply chain was already a challenging task, as you know, because there are no clear incentives for them to engage in this process. And there's no clear reward scheme and how they fit the transition and such. And I think one of the salient points from the UNGPs is that for companies, big or small, especially the big ones with the SMEs in their supply chain, to leverage all they can to support the transition of these small and medium enterprises companies. I see a number of pathways, actually. One is the preferential list of suppliers, especially like among the critical suppliers and tier 1 suppliers. By identifying this a group of willing companies to engage, I think that's a first step. Second, I think you need to support the capacity building, training, informative sessions for these companies to adjust themselves. I mean, of course, I mean, if you see like a lot of these SMEs have had decades of business relationships with big corporations, you cannot just cut them loose all of a sudden. But at the same time, how do you actually help them transition into a better position in terms of human rights due diligence? This involves like it goes from basic human rights due diligence. What does it entail? I think a lot of companies is still a mystery what human rights due diligence is and composes of. I think we should start from there. And second, I think is to actually provide as much of the tool available and channels for them to engage in this human rights due diligence and break it down for them into practical steps for them to be able to engage. And of course, certainly is commitment from all the, as Freddie said earlier, is in terms of competition, commitment from all the suppliers and buyers. If they upgrade it, which means like higher cost for them, would you stick with them because they have become a more responsible producer, but their cost is higher? Would you be able, who would bear that increased portion of the cost? So I think consumers have to get involved, buyers and clients have to get involved as well. That's just my preliminary reactions ครับขอบคุณครับ
Thank you. Let me put a question to Dr. Sri Kanya, and I think one of the points that she can now elaborate is the opportunity that is provided by the new regulation by the Securities and Exchange Commission of Thailand, also in conjunction with the Stock Exchange of Thailand this year, which will change the landscape of investment. Now we are going to see the introduction of mandatory reporting from listed companies, how they have implemented the UNGPs, as well as the carbon emission level. How the GPF now let me explain in terms of number. The GPF has asset under management of about 1 trillion baht. So it has a lot of leverage to play. Now with this introduction of mandatory reporting, how do you see the role of GPF in benefiting from that kind of public disclosure, Dr. Sri Kanya?
Thank you, Dr. Seri. Definitely, the public disclosure of responsible business conducting is very useful. It's the first step that we can get to understand the company. Without that, we would need to do a lot of direct engagement with company, which takes a lot of time and energy to do that. That's definitely very useful, and it's a basic screening process for us. What I'd like to mention a little bit regarding what Dr. Nitithorn is talking about, Dr. Seri, if you allow me.
Yes, please go ahead.
When he mentioned about responsible consumption and responsible investment and due diligence, I kind of like to make a point here that as investors who are trying very much to engage those kind of practices into our investment portfolio and also to our investment external fund managers, we come up with a lot of difficulties on that. Even we understand that there's no one size fit all strategy in doing those kind of things, but still there's too many different ways of doing it, So it's a little bit struggling in my part when we want to be serious about this kind of thing. I just do a direct message to Dr. Nitithorn. I might need his help in doing these kind of things. So my message here is that if organizations like Swiss Embassy or wherever are serious about putting a foothold in Thai market or ASEAN market, perhaps we should sit down and talk about maybe common framework of how to do it together, start from there. And then we don't have to start from scratch, If we have a common framework, common study, common understanding, then practitioner like us or investor like us could start from that beginning. And that would make our life much more easier. We are not expert in responsible investing. We are expert in investing. When you put responsible ESG impact into the pictures, there's a lot of things we have to look at, and that's a very, very delicate way, very difficult. Thank you, Dr. Seri.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Seri, can I come in here real quick? Sorry.
Go ahead, Dr.
Yeah, just to support what Dr. Sri Kanya just said. I mean, Global Compact Network is happy and willing to engage and form this kind of partnership, and also start this dialogue across all stakeholders to get this responsible investment, responsible purchase and production and consumption conversation going by linking all the relevant dialogues and tools available in the market, so as to make them all complementary with each other, rather than creating unnecessary extra burden for all the companies involved. Because you see, I mean, climate change is coming up, human rights is coming up, anti-corruption is coming up. I mean, all of this, if taken in the wrong way, I mean, could just be simply a simple rejection by companies. They see it as an extra burden. So we have to create this kind of incentive schemes and make their lives a bit easier to engage. ขอบคุณครับ Thank you ครับ
Thank you. I think I have two comments and one particular question from Kun Apichai Sunchinda, who is a colleague back when from ASEAN. He has said that the ASEAN Ministers of Agriculture and Forestry has adopted in October 2018 the ASEAN Guidelines on Promoting Responsible Investment in Food, Agriculture and Forestry. And he has a question of what extent has this guideline been promoted among the concerned parties in ASEAN, and more importantly, being implemented. Unfortunately, originally we have an ASEAN representation, but we were notified that all experts have been engaged and could not join us. But perhaps if I can ask Freddie from ILO to expand on his point, and if he can relate to this one. I'll also be asking Tang, because he's from ASEAN, from Vietnam, later on about that question posed by Kun Apichai. But let's go to Freddie first and ask Freddie. Freddie, you have mentioned about the using of human rights due diligence as a tool to make business resilient. Now, let me ask you, Freddie, how has the ILO been active in this field through establishing any kind of standards or manuals? And you see that in ASEAN, Kun Apichai mentioned that we have introduced guidelines for responsible agriculture. In ILO, how active have you been in implementing this kind of standards and also manuals? And hearing from Dr. Sri Kanya or Dr. Netitorn, the difficulty in mainstreaming these standards and guidelines. What's your view on this, Freddie?
Dr. Siri, thank you very much for the question. Yes, well, this is the very essence of the International Labour Organization. I mean, from the perspective of the international labour standards, I mean, the conventions, the recommendations, as well as the protocols and the declarations, which are the main type of standards internationally, and we set them in a tripartite way internationally. Then a subgroup then are those fundamental principles and rights at work. And then there is a specific tool, which is the M&E declaration of the ILO, which is the tool for us to work with the private sector on the framework of CSR. When it comes to the implementing all these tools, all these standards, well, the ILO has different channels. It provides some advisory to our constituents, to the government through the Ministry of Labour, to the employers' organizations, as well as to the workers' organizations. But we also have a big number of programs working in this area, in this region, in Asia, but in general in the world, which are funded by different donors, including also the government of Switzerland, to promote the implementation of decent work conditions in specific sectors, such as garment. That is the case of Better Work, which is a known program, but also, I mean, in other sectors, targeting specific issues such as migrant workers and gender, and that is the case of Safe and Fair, as well as Triangle programs. When it comes to this specific program I work on, which is Responsible Supply Chains in Asia program, and as it was actually mentioned by Dr. Netitorn, well, we work on tailoring some of the tools for small and medium enterprises. They need to be tailored to specific sectors, because it's not the same to implement tools for agriculture than, for instance, automotive sector or electronics. But then also they need to be adapted in terms of the content, the language, and some of the technological barriers faced by some of the SMEs. So I would say I would be very much in line with what has been mentioned by Dr. Netitorn on the need of this type of tools for SMEs, but also what was mentioned by Dr. Tang from the National Economics University of Vietnam on the need to work with cooperative and small producers, because indeed they are in the lower tiers and they need to be also included in these dialogues on social responsible labor practices.
Thank you, Freddie. I think the question to Tan is that we know how cooperatives have played an important role in mainstreaming and integrating SDGs and UNGPs in Vietnam. And you also mentioned certificate of safe products. Now, a question from Kun Apichai, and I'm not sure whether you are aware of these ASEAN guidelines on sustainable forestry and agriculture, but a question to you is, what do you think the role, the importance of certificate has been? In the sphere of UNGP, we see on the remedy part, labor inspector and use of standardization. To what extent has certificate and certificate system been used to promote SDG 12 in particular and UNGPs in general? you can mainstream a lot of these standards through certification and monitoring and assessment. So a question to you is, the certificate system, how effective has it been? And also, if you can elaborate, I see a number of points raised on incentives. What kind of incentives have been given to cooperatives for them to be able to educate, provide technical assistance to farmers and consumers to be aware of these global and regional goals and aspirations? Dr. Tang.
Thank you, Siri. First, let me talk about the certificates. Since the move toward more responsible business practices in Vietnam is new, I think we see a clear trend in the last 5 years. Before that, it's not clear, right? So the government play a very important role in promoting these trends. And one of the roles that they have done is to introduce good agriculture practice, domestic good agriculture practices, and try to certify any producer who follow these practices and promote the producer for this. So we see a lot of Vietgap certificates on the product, agriculture products. And I think that contributes a lot to the development, because customers now are believe more in Vietgap certified products, and they like to pay a little bit more for that, and that's a good chance. Also, we see in our recent study some certificate on organic production, and we call it PSG. I think participation, I don't know, but the abbreviation is PSG for organic, and that's appear in the market. If they get that certificate, consumers are willing to pay more, and the market for that is limited. Well, it's expanding. The competition is limited. So anyone who gets that certificate have better chance for sustainable development in their business, better performance. So most of these certificates that we saw is on food safety and environment protection. On human rights, we have not done much on that, especially for farmers and cooperatives. Yeah, but I think we may need to learn from other countries too. Now, talking about incentives, that's what we learned in our recent studies, is that we cannot just talk to people and say, try to do cleaner and better business, because like the ambassador say, they need to make profit and they need to have a good business. So the incentive system is very important for cooperatives and farmers in Vietnam. The incentives now come from two sources. One is customers. If they export, like the best cooperatives in our chat before, the European customer put all kind of requirements on good practices and human rights. So they cannot do child labor. They have to pass the work condition. They cannot use forest land to plant the coffee to sell to the customer. So, and then they have to be monitored. So now they are learning that, and they internalize this practice more. The other sort of incentives is local governments. They promote for good practices and also introduce the capacity building. For now, these are the incentive source that I saw in Vietnam, mostly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tang. I think we haven't had time to talk much about the various footprints that certificate can play a great role. Now it's becoming a big issue in Thailand and elsewhere as well. We talk about carbon footprint. We also talk about water footprint, and last but not least, waste footprint. That is directly related to SDG 12. How certificate and standardization on this field can help mainstream the SDG 12 itself, and also UNGPs in general. I think we have time, so if I can give the floor to Professor Vitit to reflect his views. If the organizer can put a microphone to Professor Vitit so he can more aptly illustrate his point. Professor Vitit, are you still here with us?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Hello.
We do hear you very well. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. Just a few points just to add to the richness of the discussions. The first point that I raised was the transversal issue of gender, particularly, of course, covering women and also in the perspective of gender diversity. And we noticed, particularly with COVID, that in many countries, unemployment has been particularly affecting women. For example, a country next door, the textile workers tend to be women, so they are impacted most at this point in time. And of course, they stay home. So what we're witnessing is a different type of consumption at home. Also coupled with domestic violence, because it's not an ad hoc consumption, it's all-day consumption at home. And I think it's something we have to think about in terms of how we enable a psychologization of consumption, particularly at home at this point in time, with due respect for gender sensibility. Secondly, across the business and human rights phenomenon, of course, the fact that people who protest, who advocate, are being prosecuted or litigated against. And we have a term for this internationally, it's the SLAP, it's strategic litigation against public participation. It may come from the business sector itself, or it may come from the government, or a mix. So this is something we have to accommodate in terms of how to have a language, a discourse with people, so that we can have a common ground of disagreement without unnecessary, unpleasant actions taking place, as we witness. And in Thailand, we noticed several hundred women human rights defenders who've been prosecuted at this point in time. Thirdly, incentivization, I think, is very important. And the opposite of the dichotomy is, of course, sanctions, so to speak. But I think we prefer to talk about incentives. And I did hear once upon a time that the best incentive the business sector wants is transparency. And respect for its work, particularly from the government itself. And I think, frankly, there are more issues here at play, as we've been hearing, in terms of tax, subsidies, customer response, and beyond. So it's a whole range. And we have to think very hard about revival at this point in time through incentivization because of the regression now because of COVID. Fourthly, adaptation to new activities. Both the consumer and the producer might have to adapt, or at least the worker in the middle. Why? Because we're witnessing more automation. So the reskilling and upskilling and sort of diversification, not just of the product itself, but how we diversify our abilities in terms of capacity and capability, I think is very challenging, particularly, of course, in the face of the robots that are arriving today. Fifth, I'm intrigued that the responsible business in our region, for me, should be very much to do with food security, because we are a cradle of food. And as we've seen, look at the lockdowns, how people are kept away from food and markets and the impact. So we should invest well in our value added and not forget food and food security and access to food. And finally, to be fair, of course, in terms of shared stakeholdership, both in terms of benefit sharing as well as improvement, how to have real participatory monitoring and review of responsible business practices. And the difficult part is to have your so-called opposite who disagrees with you on board to monitor. The easy part is to have those who are your friends. And I think we have to work out a certain way of qualitatively proving that it is participatory monitoring and the follow-up, which is reflective of the full range of stakeholders, not just friends of this group or that group. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Vitit. I think it's kudos to your point that the interrelatedness or complementarity between SDGs and human rights. And also, we must not forget when we talk about COVID-19, we must not forget in the equation or ecosystem of rights that freedom of expression must still be there. And as well as the issue of food security, which underpins SDG 12 as well. Before I go to the last round of reflection from my panelists, I like to present a point from my own hat as member of the UN Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, as well as the UN in general. The ESCR committee has produced a general comment number 24, in which we advocated strongly for the mandatory use of human rights due diligence. You can go to general comment number 24 to consult that particular reference. And we are glad to see that the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights also advocate and encourage member states of the UN to put human rights due diligence into practice. Now, we hear very strongly from this panel that human rights due diligence can be introduced and implemented through various means, the use of incentive, technical assistance, as well as the leverage played by institutional investor play an important role in making businesses large and small, domestic and international, aware of the importance of this particular goal. So that's my personal reflection. And now I would invite my panelists to reflect perhaps a minute or two each, not more than that, because we are closing. From Dr. Netiton to Dr. Tang, how you envision your organization to play a further role in mainstreaming SDG 12 and human rights due diligence? That's the question to you to reflect briefly as an ending to this particular session. Starting with Dr. Netiton, please.
ครับขอบคุณครับ Dr. Seri, and pleased to be a part of this panel again. I think what the Global Compact Network Thailand aims to achieve in the end is to get collaboration across the value chain, ranging from producers all the way to clients and buyers, all the way down to consumers and investors. It would be an effort, a fruitless effort, if corporates upgrade their responsible business conduct, but then the clients shifted somewhere else because of higher cost. And at the same time, the certificates won't work if consumers don't support it, or the shareholders don't support the adjustment towards more responsible business conduct investment of the companies at the General Assembly meeting. So what Global Compact Network Thailand tries to do is to catalyze all these actions from various stakeholders within the society to achieve this goal. Thank you, Krab.
Thank you, Dr. Netiton. Dr. Srikanya, you have 1 trillion baht under your management. What are you going to do with that in terms of SDG 12 further on?
Yeah, we expect very much ourselves to do better and more than that. But as I said earlier, that we have to balance between our fiduciary responsibility to the members and also social responsibilities. I think what we can do further, if the government play a role here, if a government comes and issue like a government policy, tax incentive, those kind of incentive, we talk about incentive. But if the incentive go to the investor like us, then I think we can have an excuse to do more in this kind of thing. And the second point that you mentioned regarding due diligence, already said that we need kind of a standard, international standard, something that we can start, somewhere that we can start, so that we have to start. We don't have to start from zero. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think we are being pulled, of course, when we talk about that, Freddie talk about the roles of buyers and suppliers. And I think when standards like modern slavery is being introduced by the buyers, so suppliers that seek to export to those markets, especially in the UK and Australia that has introduced this kind of legislation, already have to adapt themselves to align with the standards, including human rights due diligence as well. So I think that there is a great opportunity to play by players like the GPF as well. Freddie, you mentioned M&E declaration. Further to that, you have any further points to make, or how you are going to align the ILO with other players in this particular ecosystem? Freddie.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Siri. No, indeed, I mean, for the ILO, this is a call to continue working with our tripartite constituents, the governments, to ratify the fundamental conventions of the international labor standards and the fundamental conventions and principles on the rights at work. With the trade unions, all the support from the International Labour Organization for them to work with the workers, especially in the new forms of work posed by the future of work, gig economy, and those in the informal sectors. And of course, jointly with our partners, employers organizations, for them to provide tailor-made and relevant services for the for the businesses, but particularly small and medium enterprises, to implement social responsible labor practices at the company level.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Dr. Tang,
Yes.
any reflection? Please go ahead.
I think this is a good question for us as well. We would like to contribute more to the capacity building for the communities, SME, on how to adopt responsible business practice and at the same time making profit. So changing the business mindset and also business practices to include all these objectives together. That's what I see that we would like to do in the next few years. Thank you.
Thank you. That's also music to my ears. Ladies and gentlemen, we come to an end, the end of our session, the inaugural session, substantive session of the Business and Human Rights, Bangkok Business and Human Rights Week. This is the 5th installment, so it warms my heart to see the continuity of this event. I'll bring this session to a close, but let me give the last word. I think the key word to me is multi-stakeholders. At the beginning, I pointed the picture of various multicolored stakeholders. So now I'm glad that we have woven the interrelatedness of this multi-stakeholder approach that we have taken. So my thanks go to all the panelists and as well as the organizers, particularly the Swiss Embassy and Mahidol University, as well as my successor, Professor Amarat, who will join us later on the program as well. So ladies and gentlemen, this session is now adjourned, and I give the floor back to the organizers. Thank you very much. Sawadee krap.
Thank you very much, Dr. Seri. And well, this is really tremendous for all of us to be able to listen to this fruitful conversation. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the panelists and Dr. Seri Nontasud for kickstarting this important conversation on business human rights due diligence in times of COVID-19. Obviously, there are quite a number of points that we learned. For example, we understand the importance of multi-stakeholders' role in making this issue a reality, even though it is not an easy task for actors such as the government, intergovernmental organization, or business to work together during COVID-19 pandemic. But we have seen the success, and we can also learn some issues as well as the barriers in promoting these issues at the regional level. So I hope the audience learned a lot of good points as the inaugural conversation for the day, for this forum. We will have a lunch break for approximately an hour, and then we will continue this conversation on SDG 12 and business and human rights through this forum with the next panel. Right? When we come back after lunch, we will look at more on the framework, the regulations, and variety of other stuff that we are facing in terms of business and human rights when it goes to the particular point on responsible consumption and production. So stay tuned with us and please enjoy your lunch. We'll be right back here at 1 o'clock. Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the afternoon session of the ASEAN Swiss Forum on SDG 12, Business and Human Rights. Well, this morning, I believe we learned a great deal of knowledge and experiences from speakers, panelists, and participants who share their idea and thought related to the evolution of the concept and the policies at regional levels on business and human rights. Particular panel one discussed in details the concept of due diligence. Well, in this afternoon, it's really a great honor for the organizer of this event to meet with the team who offered to be in this panel. In the panel 2 afternoon session, we'll pretty much focus on business and human rights in action. So we moved more from the concept of policy into actions. And when I look at the list of the panelists, they come from all over the world, from Vietnam, Switzerland, Thailand, for example, and from eclectic backgrounds. So I believe that in this panel, we will learn a great deal on what kind of actions that we are facing in terms of moving into the reality of business and human rights, particularly to achieve SDG 12. So with no further ado, I would like to invite the moderator for this panel, Dr. Siprapa Petcharamisi, who is a senior lecturer from Institute of Human Rights and Peace Studies at Mahidol University of Thailand. And remember, this is the regional event, so I hope that you hear a lot of stories from Southeast Asia. Dr. Siprapa, the stage is yours now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. As our MC has kindly introduced us and lead us to our panel already. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, very good afternoon. Welcome to the second panel. I would like to thank organizers, in particular the Swiss Embassy in Bangkok, for inviting me to moderate this session. It's an honor. I understand, at least from our MC, that most of you joined the event since the very beginning and got good background, business and human rights in the context of how it contributes to realizing the SDGs 12 already. Of us know that SDG 12 focus on sustainable production and consumption. In the agri-business sector in particular, for our panel, the previous session focused, as we heard, on human rights due diligence in terms of coronavirus. This session now is about business and human rights in action. I just want to start by explaining a bit about the objectives of this panel. There are twofold. One is really to understand the challenges of multi-stakeholder cooperation in the implementation of the UNGP and other relevant standards, and highlight examples, good practices with a focus, as I mentioned, on agricultural sector. Of course, this is a regional forum and attention is paid on ASEAN. The second is really to provide a platform for peer learning in which we welcome concrete examples, as I mentioned, and problems linked to business and human rights. We hope to foster pragmatic exchanges and open dialogue with mutual respect. For this, I kindly request you to take into consideration that other participants might face different challenges than actually they may have different information stakeholders, yet we are here for a common purpose, which is mutually learning. Within 75 minutes, we have 5 speakers for this panel. I'll be trying to manage time as good as possible. Each speaker will be having 7 to 8 minutes to share what they have to say. I seek kind cooperation from the panelists to stick to time allocated so that we have at least 30 minutes to entertain questions and discussions from the audience. We have a very good mix of audience. I'm really grateful. Of course, participants are invited to send your questions or comments via chat as well. For speakers, I will notify speakers with my 2-minute banner. I'm not quite sure if you can see it. I just produced just now, which means that I ask you to conclude in 2 minutes. Sorry for this gesture in advance. As we heard, the implementation of UNGP and other relevant standards are focused on the prime responsibility of states to protect, for business to respect, and of course, for all entities to provide proper remedies to those affected by activities of the companies. This is in cooperation with other stakeholders, including civil society. We are lucky, as our MC has mentioned, that for this panel, we have representatives from state, multilateral organizations, business companies, and civil society. I would like to first invite a representative from the state, Excellency Molimin Abdi, Director General of Human Rights, Ministry of Law and Human Rights of Indonesia. He'll be sharing with us how Indonesia implement UNGP in the context of realizing SDG 12. sustainable productions and consumption. Please, Excellency, you'll be having 7 to 8 minutes, please.
Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, on behalf of the government of the Republic of Indonesia, I wish to extend a very warm welcome to all of you to this panel to discuss business and human rights in action related to SDG 12. Let me also take this opportunity to express my appreciation to the Switzerland Embassy in Bangkok and the ASEAN Centre for Sustainable Development Studies and Dialogue to invite me on behalf of the government of Indonesia. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Indonesia has built numerous concrete steps which have been conducted intensively by the government to promote business activity that is suitable with human rights value since 2013, involving government sector, civil society organization, academic and business actor. The national focal point on business and human rights 17 under the coordinating Ministry of Economic Affairs. However, to strengthen Indonesia's commitment in fulfilling and respecting aspects of human rights, since 2020, the role of the national focal point has been transferred to the Ministry of Law and Human Rights under the Court of Human Rights. Simultaneously, the Ministry of Law and Human Rights also acts as the coordinator of the National Task Force on Business and Human Rights, which consists of various key players from ministries of agencies, Indonesian Chamber of Commerce, business actor, civil society group, and academy. The task force is also currently drafting the national strategy for business and human rights as a baseline for UNGP's implementation in Indonesia. It is planned to be done in 2021. There too, the National Focal Point has launched a web-based voluntary self-assessment application to assess companies' operational risks related to human rights abuse, named as PRISMA, or Business and Human Rights Risk Assessment. Indonesia also has a mechanism for non-judicial dispute resolution through the Public Communication Services Unit within Directorate General of Human Rights, which act as a mediator in dispute resolution outside the judicial mechanism for the business sector. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the government of Indonesia is actively involved in several efforts to implement the Sustainable Development Goal, including SDGs 12, related to responsible production and consumption, one of which through ASEAN cooperation in food, agriculture, and forestry. In the agricultural sector, we would like to highlight the result of the study on palm oil, which show that it has a major contribution to the achievement of SDGs with ag advantage compared to other vegetable oil. To achieve this, Indonesia has introduced the standard and principle on the palm oil industries, which is known as Indonesian Sustainable Palm Oil, or ISPO, through ISPO certification system as stipulated in the Presidential Regulation Number 44 year 2020. In this regard, ISPO certification also required palm oil companies to observe the principle of labor and environmental responsibility, which include requirement to guarantee workers' rights, health, and safety, to ensure fair treatment of workers, and also environmental standard. The ISPO is not only binding to big-scale palm oil industries, but also for small-scale, to make sure that Indonesian palm oil products are safe and responsible to the human rights as well as environmental aspects. By 2020, there were 40 palm oil companies that received ISPO certificate. Meanwhile, 19 companies from 145 who already applied in the middle of process for ISPO acknowledgement. Sorry. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in cooperation with the private sector, Indonesia also making effort to encourage the implementation of responsible consumption and production at the company level through the implementation of proper or company perform rating program. Proper was developed to assess and reward companies that actively reduce environmental impact and maintain their company reputation. There are 5 proper categories, namely gold, green, blue, red, and black, which are the order of the company perform achievement of the best to the lowest. Another government policy related to the private sector is a green industry certificate held by Ministry of Industry. Green industry certificate is a form of non-fiscal incentive from the government to industries that have made efficient use of material, energy, and water resources so that a sustainable industry can be achieved. In cooperation with financial institutions, since 2017, the Financial Service Authority has enacted regulation regarding the implementation of sustainable finance for financial service institution, issued and listed company to provide guidance and encourage the escalation of sustainability reporting publication. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, we would like to reaffirm that Indonesia is highly committed to strengthening the implementation of SDG 12 and UNGPs and the domestic, regional, and international level. On this occasion, is also would like to inform you that Indonesia will host the regional conference on business and human rights in the second semester of 2021. This conference will discuss the development achievement, best practice, and challenges ahead of UNGP's implementation in the ASEAN region within the framework of the first decade of UNGP's implementation. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I have come to the end of my presentation. I wish you all good luck and have a great discussion in this session. I thank you. Bila taufiq wal hidayah, wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much, Excellency, for a very precise introduction of the implementation of standard in Indonesia, especially with focus on the establishment of different institutions and putting in place standards. Wondering if you are still with us. Excellency Abdi, are you still with us or you already left? I heard that you had to leave earlier, so I wonder if you would be able to accommodate a few questions, if any. Okay, I'm afraid he left already. All right, so I will be moving on to our second speaker, Ms. Shivani Kanabiran, who is policy advisor of the RBC Center at OECD. Shivani will focus on FAO guidelines for responsible agri-supply chain and also OECD support on implementation. Shivani, please, it's your turn.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator, and thank you to the organizers for this opportunity. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Shivani Kanabiran. I work at the OECD. Could we have the slides up, please? The administrative host, if you could please screen the slides. Thank you so much. Let's go to the first slide. I just wanted to take a few minutes of your time this afternoon to walk you through what we're doing at the OECD, how we're promoting and supporting responsible business conduct, and just some examples of what we think can work. And many of the things that the minister actually pointed to already that's taking place in Indonesia is actually the ways that we also think we can really scale up for implementation. So at the OECD is first of all, in case folks don't know, it's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's an international organization, but actually its membership is quite small. It's about 38 countries, mainly countries from I would say the developed world. But we also have lots of cooperation, and we work very closely as well with a number of key partners globally, notably countries in Southeast Asia. And I'll talk a little bit about our work in Asia and Southeast Asia in particular. So what do we do? OECD does a number of different things. We work on things like tax transparency. You've probably heard about the base erosion, profit shifting. Some of you may have heard about our work on education, on the PISA studies, but we also work on responsible business conduct. And by this, what we're talking about is what are expectations internationally that governments want to see from businesses. And when I speak about businesses, it's really the full range of businesses, right? Private sector, state-owned enterprises, large companies, medium-sized companies, small companies. So it's the full range. So one of the things we do first was we set international standards, and this has really very broad buy-in. And this is important because there are lots of standards out there that are either set by policymakers or set by private sector or demands from the civil society. But the international standards that we develop at the OECD are very much developed through a multi-stakeholder process. So this means it's got the input from business, from civil society, trade unions, policymakers, as well as international organizations. And as the moderator said, I'll talk a little bit about the one in particular where we focus on the agri sector, which we developed together with the FAO. And the FAO, as all of you know, is the UN Organization for Food and Agriculture. Can you go back to the first slide, please? It's not yet finished. Sorry. I'll say next slide when it's time to go to the next slide, okay? So we work in partnership with stakeholders. And this is important to remember. We all know, and I think in the morning panel you heard about the different discrete responsibilities of government, business, and other stakeholders, the respect, remedy, protect, respect, remedy framework of the UN, right? So at OECD, we work, of course, with governments, and the governments, they have a real role to promote, but also to monitor the uptake of standards. And that's important. The minister mentioned, the policy coherence that they're doing at Indonesia, how they have this focal point to look at our responsible business. And this is important because you do need governments to back up these expectations. It's not only on the private sector, or it's not only on business. Of course, we expect business to uptake and implement because they're the ones that need to actually do the work, you know, if you look at it, right? So that's what we talk about when we're looking at our standards are really how can businesses and how can we work with businesses to effect implementation and uptake at scale. At scale means globally. And this also includes the aspect of access to remedy, which is also a really critical component. So we work very closely with different state agencies. These are called the national contact points for responsible business conduct. We also work very closely with civil society and unions. And that's what we do to really establish, first of all, promotion of these guidances and guidelines, because if people don't even know what it is, then how are they going to implement it? But very importantly, there's also at the OECD this mechanism to actually monitor and handle non-compliance. And it's a non-judicial mechanism. And this is helpful because it's out of the courts as a starting point. It doesn't mean that you can't go to court, but the idea is to come to some kind of resolution and mediation. And that's also something that, that we support at the OECD. Okay, next slide, please. I wanted to just share a little bit about what we're doing in agriculture, because I know that this is a conference really focused on that. And agriculture, as you know, is a huge part of the solution for us to reach SDG 12, as well as a range of other SDGs. Frankly, actually, you could almost tie agriculture and the engagement and the need for engagement of the agricultural sector in order to achieve a wide range of SDGs. Yeah? So this was developed together with the FAO, again, in partnership with the different stakeholders I mentioned. And the way we think about responsible business, a key part of it is this idea of, or this concept of due diligence, risk-based due diligence along the supply chain. And when I say along the supply chain, I really mean along the full value chain. So we're talking about the need for companies at every part or every stage of the supply chain. So I'm going to be a bit technical here. So this is not guidance or expectations only for producers, right? It's guidance and on due diligence for investors, producers, traders, food and beverage manufacturers, all the way up to retailers. So you see everybody along the value chain is actually understanding what it is we're trying to do and working towards a common goal. I think another, so that's one of the major value add of this particular instrument. It's very comprehensive as well in coverage. We don't just focus on human rights, but we're looking as well at human rights, environmental issues, access to land, also animal welfare. Obviously, animal welfare, it covers some supply chains and not all supply chains, but as you can see, it's quite comprehensive. And of course, also the issues around governance. One of the things that we try and do at the international level, and I speak, I would say, certainly on the OECD level, but also across international organizations, and this forum is an example, is that we work closely with other standards. So you see all the different standards at the bottom there. And I see in the chat, Apichal is being very proactive by focusing as well on the ASEAN RAI guidelines. And exactly that, the RAI guidelines are also referenced in this OECD FAO guidance. And we've actually worked to see how we can also collaborate with groups like Grow Asia, for example, so that there's less confusion in the marketplace about what needs to be followed. And in fact, I would say broadly, we are all really striving to the same goal, which is sustainable production, consumption, looking at a range of risks, and particularly this concept of due diligence. So if there's one thing businesses need to make sure they really understand is this due diligence and what exactly it means. Let's go to the next slide. So for us at the OECD, we are really looking at how can we get implementation at scale, because we've got these standards. Standards are have taken some time to develop, and these were developed back in 2016. So really, we've been around. It's been around for some time already. How do we actually get this understood, implemented at scale? And we have a couple of ideas on that. And here are the 5 I wanted to just very quickly highlight. One, of course, is to really integrate these expectations into regulatory frameworks, and regulatory frameworks are done at the national level typically, or at a regional level, and industry standards. And that's a huge lever, because the minute it's part of law, most companies, not just the progressive ones, will take it on board. The other one I wanted to highlight is on certification schemes. The minister also mentioned the Indonesian palm oil certification. What we are proposing now is to align or to assess certification schemes, any certification scheme that's out there that's willing to review their their standards and look at their standards and see how they could align or compare to the international standards. And then finally, of course, there's basics of communication, language, and training. Training is a huge thing. So number 4, we are actually now developing e-learning, which will be a public good and will be open to all stakeholders. So that's, I think, something to keep a lookout for. I've just gotten a notice that I should hurry up. So may we go to the next slide, please? So some of the actions we're doing, we've launched a number of pilots. We've done a global pilot in the agri sector that was done in 2018, 2019. We've also had a pilot in Southeast Asia with agricultural businesses. And I'm very willing to share. You'll see at the next final slide when we end, I'll have links there and I'm happy to share this presentation with all of you. I mentioned the e-learning courses. That's actually going to be coming up this summer, July or so. And as I said, this will be, for now, we've done it in English, but if there's interest from people in the audience who would like to see if this is available in different languages, I'd be very happy to speak with you bilaterally. So just email me. I'll share my email with everyone as well after this call. We're also doing regionally, so not just global or Southeast Asia, but also in the Latin America and Caribbean area. We are launching a new tool that's going to be looking at deforestation and forest degradation. That's we're doing in collaboration with the FAO, and we'll kick that off actually later in June. And we hope to actually have this available in 2022. Oh, and sorry, I missed one, which is the alignment assessment methodology. That's the thing in the middle there you see. And then I'm really excited to say that we're developing a methodology now for the agri sector. We've done this in other sectors. The OECD also does RBC, or responsible business, in minerals, in garment and footwear. And so now we're doing an alignment assessment methodology for the agri sector. And I think that will be a real, I hope that will be a real lever for change. And then finally, I just wanted to leave you with the invitation. There's a global forum on responsible business conduct that will take place from the 15th to the 17th of June. And everybody on this call is certainly very welcome to attend that as well. You'll learn a lot more about what we do on responsible business, working with business in particular and other stakeholders. Final slide, if we may go to that, please. Yeah, so here are some of the links that you have. I don't expect folks to memorize any of this, or you don't need to take a photo. This is being recorded, so you'll have access to it. And I'm very happy to also share these slides with the organizations for distribution. So, Madam Moderator, I will leave it there, and I hope I kept within the time frame. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shivani. I would love to have you to continue, but unfortunately we don't have much time. I think what Shivani has already shared is very concrete, and I am happy to see that there are many learning materials that we can access. And of course, a lot to share, especially when it comes to South Asia. I guess, Shivani, you will be staying with us to address your further questions. Thank you. So I'm now moving to our third speaker, Pedro Fernandez-Diaz, who is head of PSC at, I like this name quite a lot, Responsibility Investments. He will be touching upon private, finance sector, from private finance sector perspective on UNGP, RBC and other standards, and of course its implementations. Pedro, please.
Good afternoon, Dr. Sripapa. Thank you so much for your kind introduction. And let me start by thanking the organizers of the event, and especially the Swiss Embassy in Bangkok, for inviting me here. So as you correctly said, my name is Pedro. Let's just stick to my first name. I work for a Swiss asset manager called Responsibility Investments that has been doing impact investing for more than 17 years now. Now, those of you that are not familiar with the terminology, impact investing is an investment that seeks to create positive environmental and or social return alongside with financial return for the investors. No, we manage money on behalf of our investors, and we do private debt and private equity. We don't invest in large multinationals and we only do emerging economies. No, we don't invest in large multinationals. We only channel money into micro and SME companies, which cater for roughly 400 million worldwide. No, we invest out of the 400 million of formal SMEs and micro companies in the world. we invest in around 300 only. We are active in around 70 countries, 70, and all the countries in which we invest are, let's say, designated or called as emerging economies, no, emerging markets. 1/3 of the investments that we do are actually in the region, no, in Southeast Asia. And what I would like to do is to, I don't have a slide, so I hope that my presentation will be shorter than 8 minutes. If not, let me know, please. What I would like to do is to start putting things in perspective. No, I was just listening to the very interesting presentation from Shivani from OECD. And actually something very interesting that I find here is that it's actually the experience that we have. No, in at least as a company in the private financial sector, a small company in the private financial sector, is that a lot of the information that it's available out there, it's for companies. And by companies, I mean the companies that have to typically implement the requirements. No, if you look at, for example, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, or companies that have to assess other companies when doing that. But I don't think that there is, in the broader landscape of guidelines and documents, enough supporting material for the financial sector. So this is a challenge that I would like to explore during my intervention today. Why is this relevant? Well, because I'm here talking about about my experience and the challenges that I face or that we face in my company from the financial sector, but also because of the following. When you're a company, let's forget about large multinationals. So when you are an SME company in the agriculture value chain, providing services or products for other companies or for clients, then you typically have, and sorry for the oversimplification, but you typically have 3 main inputs of requirements. One is illegal, the regulatory one, no? And we were just listening to the intervention from the gentleman from the Indonesian government, no? So that is a key one. That is, cross-cutting across geographies, and whatever the government says, when there's a regulation in place, you need to listen to that, no? Then you have the clients. And the clients here, for example, are those large multinationals that have requirements and that adhere to certain guiding principles and requirements, and that will cascade down those requirements into the supply chain. What the large multinationals tend to do, some of them, not all of them, is of course prioritize suppliers. No, so they will say, okay, which are my critical suppliers, and they will probably allocate more resources and more energy and more time to do a proper human rights due diligence on those. That is at least the experience that I had when I was working in large multinationals like this, no, in the past. The third one, and here apologies in advance for omitting other stakeholders, no, but the third key one is for sure the investors, no, the people that give money to the company and that allow them to operate together with the clients and the regulators. I believe these are typically the 3 types of inputs that are more commonly known in any company in the world, including those in the agricultural value chain, when the board of directors of that company sit together at the table. And what is the difference with the financial sector? That we tend to not, so we have to assess all investments that we do because they are all equally relevant. No, I mean, of course, in some cases we have more exposure. We will have a long-term exposure, but in the end, the type of due diligence that we tend to do is pretty standard, meaning that we always assess all companies. We don't discriminate them based on how critical they are. We need to ensure that we do a due diligence, no, and that we cover the very basic and minimum stuff. So while a large multinational will typically allocate and do a very good job in some of their suppliers, the truth is that if you have 3,000 suppliers, you might end up just focusing on a handful of them. And then for the others, you might, and here this is just an oversimplification, no? But you might only do, I don't know, a high level assessment. Whereas what we do, at least our responsibility, it's probably the opposite. We don't go above and beyond in terms of some of the investments as the large multinationals can do in the key suppliers, but we do assess all suppliers irrespective of whether we are investing 2 million or 20 million. The level of due diligence that we need to put in place is the same for us, okay? Which is something that needs to be well understood. because this has implications. This is what I want to get in terms of the resources that we can allocate. No, of course, if we are going to do a very thorough due diligence and we are going to get a certain leverage because we are going to invest 20 million, we will typically do the due diligence with more people, with more resources. If we're going to do 2 million, we will have to do it ourselves. And this is what I'm getting into. No? So we, as I said before, we invest in 300 companies worldwide. The SMEs that will provide agriculture products and services, because we do agriculture in the region, to the large multinationals. And yet, there's not a lot of guidance and there's not a lot of tool. And there's something that Shivani mentioned in one of the slides. There's not enough training that is catered for us. So we had to do a lot of we have to overcome a lot of the challenges by finding support and by finding guidance, because there's not, I believe, there's not yet enough resources, enough tools, and enough training for the investment sector in agriculture to do this type of assessments properly. And why is this relevant? Again, because of the power that we have to do more good assessments, more good due diligence on human rights across geographies, across especially the SME space, no? Where companies like us tend to be very active. And let me finish with one example. We were just a year ago doing a due diligence in the region on a very nice, extremely impactful company that went from very small to relatively mid-size in one of the leaders in one of the countries in the region. No, I'm not gonna disclose the name. The reality of these companies are, while they were providing a lot of services and products to large multinationals that were asking them to fill out questionnaires and to go through a very thorough assessment, when we went on due diligence on the ground, we found that they were hiring, or they hired 1,000 people, out of which 450, so 45% of the total workforce of the company, had no contract. They had no contract. Okay, they were temporary workers that were what they would call it promoters. No, promoters are the people that you find in the supermarket offering products to you so that you can test the products. Those people that will work only during certain seasons will work without a contract. Basic human rights, basic ILO, basic regulatory compliance. So this company working for large multinational was half of the workforce without a contract. Okay. What does it mean? Well, I'm not going to blame the clients. Of course, they were doing their job, but they didn't have the ability to see it and to spend time on the ground to assess that company, because that was one of the many suppliers that they had for the end clients or products and services that were going to be provided. Whereas us, this is one of the key investments that we have. So we had to go there and analyze it. No? The challenge was to put in context all the guidelines and all the tools to do the due diligence. No? And this is kind of the experience that I wanted to share with you. I'm going to finish here because I know that I'm probably running out of time, but I'm happy to answer questions later.
Thank you, Pedro. Thank you so much for what you just shared with us about, especially I think it's important to also emphasize about the roles of the financial sectors as well, as they are actually the one in many cases who support or which support companies. And I'm happy to learn that what you're working on is focusing on small and medium companies and enterprises, which is extremely important. Our next speaker is Dederick Pretorius. Dederick is actually working at the Compliance and Sustainability. Oh, he is a direct Compliance and Sustainability Director at the agri-food in Thailand. And he'll be addressing questions related to how how he will be implementing the standards. Dederick, please.
Yes, thank you, Madam Moderator. Also, thank you to the organizers, the attendees, and my fellow panelists. It's been very interesting so far. If you can just put up the slides, that would be great. So actually, I work for Herba Bangkok, which is the regional headquarters of the agri-food group, which is a company from Spain. Headquarters is in Spain. We are one of the leaders in rice as well as pasta processing and packing. So ASEAN and Asia is, of course, a very important region for us. Next slide, please. As you can see here, first off, it's important to note that EBRO is a signatory of Global Compact, and we are also part of numerous other alliances, platforms, and initiatives. We have put the SDGs into 4 categories, which is food and nutrition, sustainable procurement, climate change, and social welfare. You can see within food and nutrition and sustainable procurement, SDG 12 plays an integral role. And then if you look deeper, you can see that SDG 17 is important to achieve all those categories. I'm not going to go into too much detail here. So if you just want to scan the QR code, you could go to our website and see our work on SDGs globally. So for this seminar or this presentation, I'm going to focus mainly on the upstream activities and not the downstream, because for our downstream, it's mainly in other regions. Next slide, please. So why is rice and agriculture important, not just for us, but for everyone? So putting it in perspective, production needs to increase by 25% in the next 25 years to meet global demand. So food security is a big priority. 1.3 billion tons of food is wasted every year, while 2 billion people go hungry and undernourished. So again, here food security plays an integral role. What not so many people outside the rice sector knows, but rice is the daily staple of 3.5 billion people and the source of livelihood for more than 1/5 of the world's population. Then also the food sector accounts for around 22% of total greenhouse gases. And also that is largely from conversion of forest into farmland. Next slide, please. So some of the key issues in the rice sector are that rice is responsible for around 10% of global methane emissions. And as you know, if you're looking at the spectrum of global or greenhouse gases, methane is one of the most potent. Rice also uses 30 to 40% of world irrigation water, and studies vary, and depending on the variety of rice that you're talking about, but to produce 1 kilogram of mulled rice, you use about 2,500 to 3,000 liters of water. Chemical use is an issue, especially in developing countries or lesser developed countries. Here, I'm not saying that, look, we should go organic, because organic doesn't mean sustainable. Here, what I am, the issue is, of course, the harmful chemical use and that it leaches into waterways as well as into the food. So food safety becomes an issue. So here, a way to combat that is to use approved chemicals in moderation and when it's required. Livelihoods of farmers is an issue because there's around 144 million smallholder rice farmers in the world, and most of those live under the poverty line, meaning that they receive as little as $2 a day or less. And also what we found is that especially in ASEAN countries, a lot of those are also heavily indebted, either with the agricultural banks, cooperatives, or other farmers. Then health and safety is an issue because these smallholder farmers, of course, they do not use PPEs when handling dangerous chemicals. Equipment could be subpar, no safety regulations. In some of the countries, there is a potential of child labor. This is also where due diligence plays a key role at the farm level. Discrimination is there. So this is ranging from discrimination on religion, gender, race, you name it. So again, in Thailand, we're very fortunate in our projects that we're running in Thailand with sustainable rice. It's around more than 60% of our farmers are female farmers. So you don't have that discrimination here. But if you go across the border or if you go in other areas of ASEAN or Asia, you could see discrimination, especially gender discrimination, as a big issue. Labor laws, in some countries, it's very comprehensive. In others, it's non-existent. So that becomes an issue. And then bonded labor or precarious employment becomes an issue, especially when a farmer is heavily indebted, and that transfers into indebted servitude, where the family members need to work for others to pay off loans and so on. Next slide, please. So what are the key challenges for addressing these issues? And here again, I'm talking more about on the farm level, as this is what is happening in ASEAN. One would be capital constraints. So smallholders, farmers not having access to finance. This could either be because of their credit rating or because they already have loans out and they cannot go any further. The reach of private sector is of course a constraint, because you can't expect the private sector or one or two big companies to reach millions and millions of farmers. So that's why when Pedro mentioned that focusing on the smaller or micro enterprises, that is the way that we're going to scale, because you're rolling it out to more. And of course, the reach is going, you'll be able to reach more farmers. The limited access to technology. So here is two key issues with that. One would be the capital cost to implement technology on farm or in the supply chain. And another one would be, of course, the access, because if you're promoting a certain good agricultural practice that requires a certain technology, it's not to say that that country already has service providers being able to provide that technology. So it's also important for financing of the service providers to help or to improve adoption of good agricultural practices by farmers. We've also seen a reluctance to accept new methods. So this can either be because they're set in their ways and they do as their father did, as their granddad did, and so on. Or it might just be down to the lack of trust. So here it could be especially a foreign company coming to a region, trying to start a project. And of course, they don't know the company, but there's ways of getting around that, and I'll focus on it in my next slide. No, please go back. So, and because there's this lack of trust, a lot of the farmers require a quick incentive. So they require something that will pay back as soon as the first crop is finished. So when you were saying that, look, the benefits to you health-wise, with the improvement of livelihood, with the reduction of greenhouse gases and so on, is going to happen within 3 crops. The buy-in is not necessarily as good as providing some premium or other incentive at the start. Some areas there's no government regulation or standard. In others, there's already implemented, and that could compete with the standard, with the voluntary standard that you're trying to apply. And then that also brings me to government willingness. So we've seen in ASEAN, some governments have put sustainability and the SDGs higher on their list of priorities than others. So it would be interesting to see how this develops towards the 2030 goals. The consumers are not necessarily willing to pay, because here you have a commodity, which is rice. Any increment is going to be transferred to the consumers. So again, consumers, especially in Europe and North America, sustainability is becoming more of a key word, and ethically sourced products. But they're not necessarily willing to pay that increment for those practices to be rolled out at farm level. And here you run the risk if you launch such a product, it might become a niche rather than we're looking at something that is scalable and that would replace the norm or that would become the norm. And then one that I didn't put on the slide, but that should be mentioned, of course, is COVID-19. That's one of the biggest challenges when you're rolling out the project or focusing on a standard implementation, because extension services and training is affected. You can't have people go to farming communities and provide training. So that's a big issue. Next slide, please.
Dederick?
Yes.
Can I ask you to conclude, please?
Yes, I'll be super quick. So the way that we do due diligence on farm, we apply voluntary standards. So this would be the Sustainable Rice Platform. I'm not sure how many has heard of this. That would mean that I'm not going to mention too much about that because Dr. Wynne Ellis, who is the executive director of SRP, will be speaking in the next panel discussion. So please join that. For our supply chain itself, we do due diligence by internal audits and by applying our own code of conduct, which incorporates the ILO, UNGP, RBC, CDEX, BSCI, and national regulation. And then, of course, the most important, as I mentioned when I started, to have SDG 12 center, you also need to use SDG 17. So PPP is extremely important, and then multi-stakeholder platforms to implement these standards. So thank you very much. Looking forward to questions.
Sorry. Thank you, Dederick. I think the focus on rice subsector and food security, as well as wide range of human rights risk in the sector, I think is extremely important, especially in this region. Rice come with rice in many ways. I think you brought up many issues that we could bring up again during the discussion panel. I would like now to call upon our colleague from Vietnam, Dr. Thị Minh Hương. She's from the Center for Development and Integration, Vietnam, and she'll be speaking from CSO perspective on especially responsible consumption. Hương, please.
Thank you, Suprabha. Well, yes, now I can share the slide from my side, right? Can you see the slide?
Yes, we do.
Thank you. Yes, so it's okay. Yes. Okay, it's very honored to speak in this panel, especially with the focus on how the actors can cooperate in responsible consumption and production, achieving both SDG 12 and business and human rights in agriculture. So that my talks will more focus on the linkage between the two frameworks, SDG 12 and business and human rights, and through the practice of responsible in consumption and production, I can see that how the actions should be called to have more like integrative framework that involve different actors achieving both SDG 12 and business and human rights. And I will also share a local initiative in Vietnam that contributes to such objectives. Right. So the first thing that the framework for responsible and production and consumption in agriculture, we can see here in this diagram, is that we can see different actors in the supply chain and global supply chain from own production side and consumption side. Along way there's distribution. There are issues that can be should be taken into consideration when we have we can work in actions. In terms of production side, there are a lot of issues such as like technological innovation in agriculture, the intensification and homogenization of agriculture, the challenge of climate change, and the practice that makes still going on, like degradation of soil and agroecological conditions and access to infrastructure. Those are, we look at the capacity, the production capacity. Along the consumption side, we can see that the growing of urbanization and the change in lifestyle that increasing the concerns and attention to health, diet and food safety, as well as the growth in population that makes the consumer's choice as different. So in focus, consumer used to play a very important role in pushing different actors, also pushing producers and the actors along the distribution to meet their demands. But how this whole framework can go to the outcome like sustainable environment, increasing the attention for human health or nutrition, the efficiency of in economy and social, including social inclusion and equity. So from that framework, if we look at SDG 12, we can see a few targets that related to, including the targets to reduce food waste, reduce food loss. This is more on production and supply side. And the other targets is on achieving environmental sound management, especially in chemicals and waste, and throughout life cycle in productions of the products. And also managing the reduce the proportion of residuals contaminated land area. And this is especially in SDG 12, we can see that companies are business are encouraged to adopt sustainable practice through not just taking social responsibility and actions on the use of natural resources sustainably and environmental protection, including reporting. So if we can see what are the linkage between the SDG 12 and SDG human rights and business, we can see that still there the challenge ahead, because first we can look at the agriculture. We can see the intensity of global CO2 emission through the greenhouse, and the impacts of global climate change on agriculture is increasingly. In such farming intensive communities, the second thing is in farming communities still put the priority on productivity rather than the food safety. So that's on the production side. As far as the growth of urban areas and urbanization, that increasingly the concerns and social and environmental problems, especially on unsafe food. In agriculture, also we can see that this is as informal sector. So the infringements of human rights, such as child labor, human safety in working conditions on farms is more, is quite invisible. Whereas if there's a little engagement of business on farm side, from the ground throughout the global supply chain or the supply chain, that still lead to a lot of lagging behind the hazardous problem. So still there's a cases that we can see that now whether we should be able to achieve the sustainable development in agriculture, again the justice through the case of Rauapt recently, the recent years, that the files the problems of cancer because the irresponsible of companies by informing about the products for farmers, farm workers, and all gardeners using the raw products, the weed killer, which harms to human health. Then the consumers uphold the companies, such pesticide company, to be accountable. So with this, the integrated framework for SDG and RCP here would be like how we can see the different roles of the different actors, and we can see that there are several tools that can be used to facilitate the partnerships in achieving SDG 12 and RCP. First of all, we can see that the governments play important role in regulating the domestic policies in terms of production, crops management, in terms of risk and harm awareness for people, and as well as for labor rights and environmental protection. The second is the business as actors, including processors and importers and retailers, should adopt more activities, not just on CSR, but more or less the human rights due diligence in their whole agricultural supply chain. We can see here also the finance investors now, they take as the ESG and human rights into their business activity, including some good practice in taking human rights due diligence and human rights impact assessment. We can see that civil groups also play a more important role. They can play a role in monitoring trade agreements, conduct of human rights impact assessment, and engage in human rights due diligence with business. At the same time, civil groups can take part in the standard setting or monitoring standards or grievance mechanism. Now there are 7 tools that can be used to promote the RCP here. First is like the trade policies and trade agreements. That's, for example, EVFTA recently in Vietnam, that promotes a lot of factors for the RCP throughout the trades and exports of products to EU. The second thing is like the standards and certification system, which should be more sustainable and include both environmental and social values and human rights as well. And the third is the technology, like the innovation, like a blockchain that can ensure transparency and traceability throughout the value chain, the supply chain. Now, with that integrated...
I'm very sorry, you may need to conclude, please.
Yeah, with that, going to actions, I think that the actions for such integrated framework should include both, like at least first, agriculture should be taken into National Action Plan for UNGP and SDG, and there should be a policies that support the rural development that include the economic opportunities as well as capacity for small farmers that contribute in such work. The third thing is the partnership between governments and business, and also civil society in promoting sustainability in agriculture. And lastly, I think it's also the standards play a role and crucial, but it's a way that adopting the standard. So with that, I would like to come to share a very small and just new initiative from Vietnam, that the Viet Pham standard, as long as with other standards existing in Vietnam and internationally, like a Global Gap, Fair Trade, or Eco, Organic, and Viet Pham standard and Viet Gap, for example, is increasingly play its role in helping business and the government, and especially building capacity for small producers to adopt the good practice in sustainable agriculture, as well as with eco-labeling. It can be linked to the markets and meet the market, the consumers. The standards should have been included and benchmarked with internationally through, say, ITC, with other standards in the world. But more importantly, that this standard, as if it includes a lot of human rights elements, like no child labor, no forced labor, no discrimination, fair and collective opportunities and capacity of small producers, as well as environmental and diversity, biodiversity. This is more comprehensive, as it is one example of that. The sustainable agriculture standards should play along and should be independent, and the certification system is independent, that promote and ensure that this transparency throughout the supply chain. Yes, so that's somehow I would like to share such one integrative framework, that different actors play different role, but should be in a strong and shared value partnership.
Thank you. You could have focused on this actually since the very beginning. It's really interesting to see local initiative. Unfortunately, you didn't have enough time to elaborate on it. I have to say that I'm terribly sorry that I failed completely to keep our speakers on time. I was expecting to have about 30 minutes or so for discussions. It seems that we have only about 7 to 10 minutes for further discussions and questions from the audience. As of now, I don't see any question in the chat, but I'm inviting our audience to address question to any of the 4 speakers. Unfortunately, our Indonesian speaker has already left. So you are now welcome, please. I don't see, let me see if there is any hand. I don't see any hand so far. In that case, I may like to ask a question, especially for Pedro, to elaborate a bit more, because I'm particularly interested in the finance sector personally. I'm sorry to start with myself. Because, for example, in Thailand and South Asian countries, these financial sectors are playing very important roles in of course, in supporting the companies. We see more and more, at least in the case of Thailand, that banking institutions are supporting projects, especially the mega projects, which actually create a lot of negative impacts on people's life. Although if you look at their website, we always see their so-called corporate social responsibility framework. So Pedro, how you assess that? Since you actually work more, I think, on small and medium business.
How much time do I have to answer your question?
Oh, my question is actually how to, I think one of the things that you were mentioning was about business accountability or business responsibility literacy, which seem to be lacking among financial institutions, banking institutions in this region. As I mentioned that you focus on small and medium enterprises, but in fact, in our countries, most of banks are actually supporting mega projects, especially in other countries. How you deal with that?
Let me see if I can answer. I think there's a second question behind your question, Dr. Sripapa, that I find a little bit more interesting here, and it's the following: we work, so responsibility. We do agriculture. Okay, we invest in SMEs in agriculture in the region. We also invest in medium-sized banks and financial institutions in the region, in ASEAN region, no, together with other regions. What I can tell you is the following: if you go to a bank and you ask to see the type of due diligence that they have in place, they will typically pull out the type of projects that you are describing. They will show you how they do due diligence, looking at large mega structures and so on, where they will typically hire consultants, no? Especially the banks that nowadays are working with the IFC and other multinational organizations, no? When we go on due diligence, because we are not interested in financing that part of the portfolio, we kind of define a portfolio that is catered for our interests. No, we want to finance gender, we want to finance rural, we want to finance SME and job creation in these spaces. We look at the due diligence that banks do in the SME space. And I can assure you that in most cases, 99% of the cases is a checklist on an Excel done by a credit analyst that has no clue whatsoever about what they are assessing. This is 99% of the samples. So I cannot talk to you about the large projects, but I'm sure that there is a little bit more emphasis put by the institution itself, but by the investors that invest in the institution to finance those projects. We are financing if you like, the second tier, the suppliers of the large projects, no, the SMEs in between, where there's no focus. No one is looking at that. And there's, I don't know how many, I mean, do the numbers, no? I think there are 70 million SMEs, formal SMEs in the ASEAN region. If no one is really looking at those beyond a checklist, the number of human rights issues that you have there in just adding numbers, it's huge. And this is what I mean. So for us, it's really very important. When I said before that there is no literacy, what I meant is that what it's really needed, it's tools and training and focus on this group, because in the end, the bank has the capacity that they have. I'm not going to blame the banks, so it is not no one's fault, no, but they do what they can with the resources that they have. So if there is no training for them, no tools for them for that specific segment, they do a checklist and they send a checklist to the client, and the client provides the answer, and that's the due diligence. So for me, it would be very important that we all try to do it. And so one of the other panelists, so Juan, was saying something about this multi-stakeholder interaction, and approach. Yes, big projects, large banks, large multinationals follow international standards. This is very well defined. Do it. I don't know how you do that, but do it well, no? But then there's the SME segment that needs a different approach. So SME is with small investors like us, with a different type of training, with more cater for the people on the ground, for the credit analysts, for the investment officers, for the people that don't really have a literacy on the topic, so to make it accessible for them. Okay, because I'm an expert on the topic, but when I speak to my colleagues, a lot of what I do is help them do assessments so that they do proper assessments. No?
Thank you, Pedro. You might not give, answer because you're not there, but it's. I think it's very important what you say. I got one question. I'm not quite sure whom to address. I guess maybe Derek and Huang, is about the life cycle of agriculture. So Derek, maybe.
I have not seen the question, so I'm not sure in what sense of life cycle they're talking.
I'm not quite sure if I understand the question well, because it was just mentioned about explaining about life cycle of agriculture, or life cycle agriculture.
I think just a quick note would be for the projects that we do implement, because the varieties that we're doing require certain purities, we would do 2 or 3 crops of one variety and then switch over. So you have crop rotation and do either other varieties. And in between planting seasons, you would do something like a mung bean to provide nutrients back into the soil. That's what I gather from the life cycle. I'm not sure what the question.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure neither. I'm very sorry here. Maybe the person who wanted to ask the question clarify a bit further. I got another question about consumers' awareness. And it said on the chat box that we talk about production, which is actually quite clear from our discussion so far. But when we talk about consumption, maybe it's a bit less clear whom to target for changing practices. I wonder who want to address this question.
I could go for that as well. It depends on which consumers you're talking about. If you're talking about Western consumers, more of them are starting to focus, as I mentioned, on the ethical consumption and sustainable practices. And let's say the products that they buy, there's a whole transparent supply chain being highlighted by the multinationals. If you're looking at local consumption, of course, you don't have that traceability that's available, and you don't have that transparency. Here, again, how you could approach, maybe they're not at this point worried about sustainability or the environment, but you could address, especially in the rice sector, about health, because controlling what inputs you put into the food that you're going to consume. So here you can highlight to the consumers, actually by controlling agrochemicals, by controlling or by having certain good agricultural practices on farm, it's healthier for you to consume. And seeing in Asia a shift where consumers are becoming more health conscious could be a way of addressing and attaching sustainability to that as well.
Thank you. I got another question from the question answer box. It's from Kun Apishai. How to ensure due diligence and compliant practice apply across the region rather than a particular country? I may ask Shivani, maybe example from OECD, because in ASEAN, South Asia, it's very hard to actually apply a regional standard. Shivani.
Thank you very much for the question. It's certainly not an easy one. Countries are also sovereign in their rights. So there's a limit to what you can also insist upon. One of the things that we work at the OECD is that we do work regionally as well with different countries. So for example, the project I mentioned, the Asia project, that brought together 6 countries in the region, China, Japan, and then 4 Southeast Asian countries. So I think that there's an opportunity, but I think we have to also understand we're on this journey, if you will, of awareness and what can be done. And I think that's what we have to be very cognizant of. I think what we've seen, even in this short project that we've had in Southeast Asia, that there's incredible willingness to learn and to understand what are the standards, how to adopt them, both from the policymaker level as well as from the business level. And I think that's the way we are actually going about it. I think to pick up on one of the other things that was talked about, that we really need this this collaboration, and even on the consumer side, we should not be focusing just on one group that needs to change. There are multiple levels actually, and even government can actually make a difference. And I think Diederik is absolutely right. The angle of coming in on the health and food quality aspect, that I think many consumers get. I mean, the whole milk scandal, we remember that, that plagued parts of Asia. Consumers also want to eat nutritious, healthy food. So that's also another angle. Consumer-facing companies, of course, have a real role to play, and they make that. But how do you get out of a niche product, right? How do you get out of just, I want to buy because it's organic and I can afford to buy it, right? That's also the pricing issue. So what role do governments have to actually promote public education, maybe on the health angle, and then use that to enlarge it to other social issues, I would say. But, I'll be very frank, I think more and more people in Southeast Asia as well are aware of the issues around, the seafood supply chain is a good example, and the issues are around that. So it's, these demands are bubbling up from different parts of the world. I think it's a bit of a fallacy to also think that, oh, it's only in the West, not in Asia and Southeast Asia. I think more and more consumers are also becoming quite aware. But I agree absolutely with Pedro on the question of the SMEs. And how do we do that? And how do we actually, get this? Maybe there's a way to partner, using training with access to finance, because you need to have these quick incentives. There's no other way. Growing seasons are so long. You can't tell a small enterprise like, okay, try this. Hopefully it works in 3 years. It's just not going to work. Anyway, I'll leave it there, but this is very, very interesting discussion and a real pleasure to be part of this panel.
Thank you, Shivani. I don't see we have actually gone, we have exceeded the time limit already. I may like to conclude by actually pointing out a few things, what we heard. The first one is that the adoption of the UN GP on business and human rights provided what I call a milestone for the corporate accountability. As we have heard, positive steps have been taken by different actors, from state that we heard from Indonesia to multilateral agencies, OECD, and companies and CSO to mainstream the responsibility to, protect, respect, and remedy. However, and this is my second point, the implementation of UNGP calls for attention to be paid to affected individuals and communities, especially through the benchmark of progress. I feel that by going into practices and experiencing gain in a particular sector, such as agribusiness that we focus on today, this may actually contribute to building clear indicators to benchmarking, especially benchmarking the progress. The third one, we heard that corporates are making efforts to insert human rights into companies' practices. We heard from Pedro, we heard from Derek, for example. This goes the same for the state and regional entities such as OECD. One thing that I think we need to question ourselves, if actually such frameworks were designed to properly address the risk of the rights holders and how they benefit from such implementation. Fourth is we heard also about the importance of capacity building in assessing risk and impacts of business activities. For this, we heard from Pedro, from Giovanni, trainings and other capacity building related platform is important. It is also essential for financial institutions to understand human rights due diligence in its assessment of investment projects. And small and medium enterprises are, for me, harder to access, I think. And I feel that this is where the business and human rights literacy is still lacking. So it is crucial for better engagement with them more. And then lastly, multiple targets rather than addressing a single actor in order to make change. I think the framework that Huang has shown us is extremely interesting, and I think could be good to elaborate further. With this, I'd like to thank all panelists and thank the audience for staying with us until the end. I think I exceed 10 minutes. I'm very sorry. Thank you so much indeed.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sri Papa, for your wonderful work on moderating this important panel. Well, as an audience, I believe we learned a lot from you and the panelists. For example, we learned the fact that in order to achieve the so-called action, we need to apply the multi-stakeholder effort, and it has to be in collective fashion whereby all stakeholders focus on putting environmental, social, and economic advantage into one. Synergizing all these concepts into the action for human rights would be the way to go. And more importantly, doing this not in the condescending fashion, but provide equality to all stakeholders, from big, large government or intergovernmental organization to small and medium enterprises. And thanks for the example and stories from different countries, from the regions, from Europe, and also from different sectors. This is really tremendous to all of us. So thanks once again, the panelists and the moderator for this wonderful conversation. And that concludes the first segment of today's workshop. But remember, we are still with the ASEAN Swiss Forum on SDG 12, Business and Human Rights. We spent the first half of this event listening and sharing knowledge with stakeholders, policymakers, those who represent the industry. Now, for any of you who have registered for the afternoon or the second segment, we've divided you into 3 groups. This is the workshop, and this workshop is something that we designed to help you to be more engaging, and you can be more interactive with it. So let me just reconfirm with you that in this part, the workshop will be reserved for the pre-register only, right? So if you have registered for the workshop, be sure that you follow the link, the URL link that we send back to you on your email as part of the confirmation. In room 1 of the workshop, we will discuss the national action plans on business and human rights and SDG 12 implementation. In room 2, we'll focus on human rights due diligence in seafood industry. And in room 3, we'll focus on human rights due diligence in the rice sectors. So be sure that you select the right room to participate, and be sure that you come back after the break. The workshop will start at 2:45, okay? But for any of you who haven't registered for this workshop, don't worry. You can sit back and relax, and you can also come back and join us at the restitution, the wrap-up, and the conclusion of this important workshop with you. We'll come back here at the restitutions of the workshop at 4:20 precisely here at this page. Okay, so again, once again, if you have any question or trouble in terms of logging in to your workshop room, please feel free to contact us. We'll be more than happy to answer the questions. This is going to be fantastic, okay? So from now on, I think you should be ready for break and come back to your workshop, right? I will see you when we return. Happy Bangkok Business and Human Rights Week, everyone. Hello, welcome all of you back to the ASEAN Swiss Forum on SDG 12, Business and Human Rights, a peer learning event. Well, I really hope that you had that wonderful learning and conversation while you were in the workshop. And for any of you who missed the workshop and would like to join with us at the final segment of the forum, you are very welcome to stay. Well, in order to conclude what we've been discussing from early morning today, we started from talking to big, broad main issue from political, policy, and practices view. We also move on into the action. We look at policy and actions in conjunction with how it works in the region. So I would like to introduce the rapporteur. the rapporteur from each room to come back and to make it clear to us. So that means they are going to reflect upon the story that they have discussed, they listened to, and pretty much what they have captured and learned from the workshop. Okay. With no further ado, I would like to announce that we have got a volunteer who decided to help us and report back. From workshop room 1, it's Livio Sarandrea from the UNDP. From workshop 2, Astrid Keinsberg from the College of Management at Mahidol University. And workshop room 3 is Frederick Steff from the Swiss government. I would like to invite the 3 speakers to be here and reflect upon what they have learned from the workshop room, please. We are waiting, right? I think a few things I had an opportunity to listen to point from a few rooms. For example, in room 1, it was fantastic to listen to academic, to professor, and to those who work from the government. For example, if you think those who work in policy don't understand the issue, as usual comment, I think we are wrong, because I can see that the concept of multi-stakeholder, that work in reality is something that we can expect. We can see that people from high-level organization to practical their work. All right, so I really hope that by this time you can really hear the real story from the rapporteurs. So the stage will be yours now. Let's welcome our rapporteur from room 1, 2, and 3.
Thank you. I assume the rapporteur 1 will go first.
That's you. Hi, Livio.
Hello, and let me take this opportunity to greet everyone and certainly congratulate the Swiss Confederation and ACSDSD for a very, very informative event, beyond certainly the workshop that I was asked to be a rapporteur for. Now, in the interest of time, let me go immediately into some of the deliberations that I have noted down, and not an easy task to consolidate in, I believe, 3 minutes, which is I'm given such a very, very rich discussion, which naturally started by Mr. Remy, pointing to the necessary alignment between the 2030 agenda and the Business and Human Rights agenda, the coherency between these two important agenda. And our session was on National Action Plan, which is the policy of business and human rights. There are many policies on the 2030 agenda, so the necessity of making sure that these two policies are coherent. The word went immediately, not surprisingly, to Kunarelak, because Thailand is the first country in ASEAN, in fact, the only one so far in ASEAN that has adopted a National Action Plan. And Kunarelak gave us what I believe was gave us many examples of the connection between their NAPs and their policies and sustainable production and consumption. But there's one that I noted down that I want to report here, because I think it's particularly relevant and particularly spot on, if I can say, in terms of examples on how you can connect the agendas. Now, in Thailand, products from eco-friendly companies and eco-friendly companies are now included in the preferred list of vendors for the public procurement. This is, to me, is a perfect example of working on two agendas at the same time and connecting the agenda of SDG 12 and the one on business and human rights. We went on, and Remy from the Swiss Confederation gave us another, I think, very good example of coherency, pointing to how the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, the second iteration that was approved in 2020, connects directly with the Swiss Sustainable Development Strategy and to SDG 12.6 specifically. So again, that coherency specifically embedded in the National Action Plans on Business and Human Rights. There were in the follow-up speeches several repeated reference to the role of consumers. It came almost in in each of the presentation pointing to the role of consumers. We heard a regional perspective from Professor Amara of ICHAR, and how ICHAR has, I believe I counted up to 15 entry points within their overall policies that connect to business and human rights, and many of those point to awareness. So again, awareness and consumers, two words that are coming back, they came back over and over. Then we heard from a representative of HELSAM in Indonesia, and how in Indonesia the National Action Plan on Business Human Rights looks at the palm oil plantations. It's an example where sustainable consumption and production are put into questions, and the link that exists with the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. I'll come back to that also at the end. We heard from colleagues of IOM in the connections with the responsible recruitment. And I'll come back to consumers, because much reference was made by the president of ECOM Agroindustrial to the role that consumers can play. When the consumers are aware of where do the products that they buy come from, they can push their industries and eventually the companies and their supply chain to act sustainably. Point was made that in certain particular supply chains, like coffee, the one that was pointed to, consumers, at least in certain parts of the world, are a lot more aware. In certain other industries and regions, may be less aware. So again, point on consumers, awareness of consumers as a way to connect these two agendas. I'll stop by a point made again by the representative of HELSAM based on a question that was posed to her. How can NAP, and there are still 7 NAPs that I'm aware of that are being drafted in Asia, not only ASEAN, but Asia, and UNDP is working on all of them. How can NAPs better connect with the SDG 12 agenda? Point was made, that connection needs to be made at the level of the national baseline assessment. It is when the picture is taken on the human rights risks that exist in a given context that the responsible consumption agenda needs to be brought in. And once that connection is made at the level of the MBA, is naturally brought into the national action plans. I believe my time is over, so I'll stop here.
Thank you, Livio. Thank you so much. Now let's move on to speaker from room 2, due diligence in seafood industry. Professor Astrid Kaitzbau from College of Management, Mahidol University, please.
Thank you very much. My pleasure to report from room number 2. Our topic was human rights in the seafood sector, and I'll try to be brief and give you an overview of the topics that we discussed. We started off by seeing that there are new trends, that consumers are now expecting changes, and they expect products to be made sustainably or responsibly. And there are also trends for legislators to focus more on responsible sourcing. And so all of that has an impact on the seafood industry. We heard from companies what are the challenges, and one of the challenges that companies face is the traceability of the sources. So even if companies try hard to trace the sources, it's sometimes not very easy. However, we also heard that there is big progress being made over the years, and that progress has been possible also, for example, in collaboration with governments, because if governments require vessel owners to register, then it's easier to trace them. And also satellite tracking has helped to trace the vessels, and that is also one aspect that helped with the traceability. And so companies also mentioned that it's only in collaboration with others that you can make progress. And so the collaboration with the government was super important, or also collaboration with buyers and suppliers working together to deal with the challenges were very important. One of the topics that was mentioned by almost all of the speakers is that the workers' voice is very important, because in the seafood industry, we're often dealing with migrant workers. There are language barriers, there are barriers of education. A lot of the workers have less or low education, and they may not even be aware of their rights that they have. And so that is an issue that in order to understand what's going on in the seafood sector, we need to understand what is the situation that the workers face, and that is something that we need to work on. And companies also talked about responsible recruitment initiatives and fair hiring initiatives, also working with recruitment agencies who have the right code of conduct and make sure that nobody has to pay for getting a job and have the workers have the freedom of movement, which was not always the case in the past. There's also an issue that what's unique about the workers in the seafood industry is that they work on boats. Many of the boats are very tiny, and it's very difficult to actually, find out what is happening on these boats. So even if we do satellite tracking, we still don't know what's happening on the boats. And it's also a mental health issues for the workers on the boats because they're far away from land and far away from contacts. And so that is another issue that we need to take into consideration. Another issue that was mentioned is that we should not see human rights due diligence as a kind of tick the box exercise. And so just because we do the due diligence doesn't mean that the lives of workers have improved already. We need to make sure that whatever exercise we do will actually in the end have an impact on the lives of the workers. And so going forward, many of the speakers said we need to empower the workers. We need to make sure that they have collective bargaining, there is transparency in how they are hired. And there's also people address the issue of the language and education barriers. We heard interesting examples of what companies do to address these issues. For example, company here in Thailand reported on using comics instead of a written text for a contract, use comics and use a voiceover in different languages so that people actually understand what the contract wants to say, because the legal language is super difficult to understand. So use a comic and use a voiceover to explain the contract and explain the workers what rights they have as some of the remedy with the crucial situation of the workers. Another aspect was also mentioned that we need remediation. That means if workers complain, they need to have a place where they can complain and people will do something about it, and workers will not be intimidated if they complain. Another issue that was mentioned is the sourcing issue, that in terms of sourcing, there's often very short deadlines and a tight budget, and it's difficult to pay relatively good wages if you have a very tight budget at your disposal. And so that is also something which also links to the general question, is the seafood industry as such sustainable? Because traditionally, it used to be local fishers work and fish for their personal families. And now it's a big industry which has environmental impact, which has human rights impact. And the fact is the industry as it is right now sustainable, or do we need to rethink the whole industry? There were also issues mentioned related to certification systems, for example, mistrust in certification systems or lack of uptake on certification systems. And so what we need is more awareness of what are the systems and trust in the systems. And all of the speakers mentioned collaborative action is very important between different businesses, government, non-government initiatives, the migrant worker community, and so on. And we also heard an interesting example from Cambodia, where fishing is not only a source of employment, but is also a source of food security, because 75% of the population in Cambodia gets their protein from fish. And the local fishery communities are endangered because of development projects that encroach on the mangrove forests, and with the pollution and destruction of the forests also pose a threat to the local communities. And there is still issues with due diligence and lack of accountability as well. And to conclude, our speakers said what are the elements that are needed. First of all, we need legislations, but it's just not only about legislations. We also need incentives. We need commitment from actors, from all of the different actors around the table. And we also need dialogue and understanding what the real issues are, so that we not just only talk about each actor about their own issues, but talk about issues that every actor is facing, and then come to joint conclusions as well. So that's my report from room number 2.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Astrid, for that rich report, and obviously that capture the whole conversation regarding due diligence in the seafood industry. So let's move on to room number 3, where we discuss human rights due diligence in the rights sectors. The stage is yours, Frederick.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me well?
Yes, please. Very
Good.
clearly.
What we have learned during the workshop is the very large importance of rice and its very specific risks or preconditions, pretty negative ones concerning CO2 emissions, women's rights, land rights, abusive use of chemicals, and the insecurity of prices and limited access to financial products and services that could somehow balance those risks. We have also learned that rice is a very specific crop, whereas 90% of its production is made in Asia. There's a very large share of it that is mostly subsistence food, around 60%, not internationally branded at all, often described as a poor people crop. And a lot of it is either consumed at home or traded within open air markets or within B2B markets, away from consumers who have the probably the highest part of the political part, the power associated to a market. We have also learned that there do exist structures that can make a difference, and it's only about us to connect the dots and make it work better. There's lots of existing initiatives and working groups that exist, including those of working in Asia around ASEAN, like the Sustainable Rice Platform. So the recommendations, I grouped them in 3. First being get organized. There do exist multi-stakeholder platforms that can do achieve a lot and bring momentum. And we have to work on equally on demand and the offer side of the market. Capacity building works, but also policy work, dialogue is important. Incentives for large companies is important. Work on long term is very important because corporates may have higher time frame than some donors because they want to have a return on their own investment. It's important to identify through these multi-stakeholders platforms where are the low-hanging fruits, what are the priorities, and who are the main important actors and blockades to the sector. Second, knowledge would be would be to know the problem. We apparently face a market where a market is per se a collective effort, and if the market is not really balanced, it requires a collective effort to make it work better, and collective cooperation is needed. And for that, we need to have clarity on the problems to avoid lack of responsibilities and inconsistencies. So we have to set clear definition of what we want to achieve, what are our action plans, who has to do what, when, and with what time, with what incentives. So the problem of the definition has been raised by several people. Third point would be on the incentives. How to fix incentives? You need to have a very good transparency and very good ownership of the results. For that, it's important to recognize the power of digital tools who can gather a lot of high-end data and make sure that everyone gets a good return, a fair share of his work invested in the scheme. Premiums have been mentioned several times as well. Premiums are not always well set. It's important that they are relevant to your target group And for that, we have to go beyond our preconceived ideas of how people work, but invest a little bit of time and surveys to ask your target group, what do they really want? And sometimes it's not about having a higher price. Sometimes it's about having cheaper input costs. So, I mean, you have to get precise in what you do, know what you want to do. And for that, you need to a very clear communication, constant one on same eye level discussion. That's what I gathered. Maybe others understood differently, but I'm happy to share and discuss with everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Frederick, for that concise report, which I think from the three reporters, we learned a number of interesting points, but three of them share common views on the fact that in order to achieve SDG 12, in particular from the business and human rights lens, collective effort is very important, and we can't really leave anyone behind. This issue is important, and I can see that an event such as this is a collective effort. So I'd like to sincerely thank the Swiss government, particularly the Embassy of Switzerland in Thailand, to host this. It's really a good place to run this show. And again, as an MC, I thank the team, the technical team from ASEAN to make this a really nice event, right? So this brings us to the final part of the event today. So in order to close the forum, I would like to invite Mr. Narong Sasitorn, Executive Director of the ASEAN Centre for Sustainable Development Studies and Dialogues, to deliver his reflection on the event and to deliver the closing remarks to the event. And from my side, thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you next year. Enjoy the Bangkok Business Human Rights Week, everyone.
Thank you very much, Kun Natawut, and congratulations to you for doing such a wonderful job as our host today. I think the time is getting late, and I shall be very brief in my remark. But first, I'd like to say that business and human rights is very important to the work we do at the center. SDG 12 is one of the 5 priority areas in ASEAN's efforts to promote complementarities between the UN 2030 agenda and the ASEAN Vision 2025, known as the Complementarity Initiative. And I'm glad that we had a very good discussion today. SDSD owes a debt of gratitude to all the distinguished speakers and panelists. Last week, we rolled out the ASEAN Gender Outlook publication in Thailand, and I'd like to note the importance of gender perspective in the implementation of the UNGPs on business and human rights. And I'm glad to hear many comments this morning on gender today. We all know that women and girls are the most vulnerable group insofar as human rights abuses are concerned. But at the same time, I also like to stress that women too are equal contributors to the SDG implementation. Distinguished participants, I think today we discussed government policy landscape. We also review multi-stakeholders efforts, advances and challenges in the implementation of UNGPs. Our focus is agribusiness, and we all know that this is the right place to start. It's the world's biggest employer. All the numbers we have heard, 70% freshwater consumption, 70% child labor, 73% deforestation, and 25% greenhouse gas. And on top of that, agribusiness has multi-tier supply chain, which makes it more complicated to track and remedy those affected by abuses. We have heard from the panels and workshops on several key progress made, but if the question is whether business and human rights or responsible business conduct have embedded in business practices among all stakeholders, the answer is probably not. Peer sharing on policies and practices is always useful and something we should do, to offer practical, doable, affordable solutions to business operators who want to make this important transition. But the real fight is how to persuade people to implement and make the right choice. It requires multi-stakeholders' determination and efforts. Governments have to be more innovative to incentivize businesses to invest in this change. Businesses must know that this is the time to make the move. It means opportunity as much as risk for their businesses. I applaud the UN Global Compact Thailand for leading the charge in Thailand. Its Business and Human Rights Academy has done remarkable things to raise awareness as well as coach SMEs and micro SMEs in Thailand. We will make a summary of our deliberation and of our discussion the whole day, and it will be available in our website soon. And on Wednesday, our representative will present key findings of our forum today to the Bangkok Business and Human Rights Week. But what I like to say at this point is that ACSDSD is planning to organize a number of follow-up activities. Our team as ACSDSD and CMMU will produce a video clip on business and human rights in action in some of the company like Syngenta, which is a leading agricultural company helping to improve global food security by enabling millions of farmers to make better use of available resources. And later this year, our team will also organize a webinar as a following up to this forum today. So stay tuned. And finally, I'd like to thank everyone for participating in today's forum. My very, very special thanks go to the Embassy of Switzerland, our co-organizer of this event, to the leadership of Her Excellency Ambassador Helena Budlager Artieda, and to her very able team, especially Ms. Jansen Vicky Fay, who has been working so hard on this project. The Swiss Confederation is ASEAN's sectoral dialogue partner, and we highly value this partnership. And we hope this first project will lead to many more projects in the years to come. I'd like to thank to all our co-organizers and supporters. They are ASEAN Secretariat, Thailand's Ministry of Justice, especially the Rights and Liberties Protection Department, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Thailand, UN Global Compact Network Thailand, ASEAN, ASEAN International Commission on Human Rights or AICHA Thailand, ThaiBev, Swiss Thai Chamber of Commerce, Nestle, CP Group, and in particular, CMMU. I also like to thank all the partners of Bangkok Business and Human Rights Week for allowing us to have this forum today as part of the bigger event. I'd like to thank UNDP Regional Business and Human Rights, UNTB Thailand, EU delegation, the government of Sweden. Now, last but not least, my thanks also go to every member of the team at ACSDSD, CMMU, and friends at ASEAN who make sure that we have a very smooth discussion today. And once again, more sincere appreciation to all our distinguished panelists, speakers, and every participant. Thank you so much, and I wish everyone a good evening. Thank you.